There is a river in the north of China that carries so much yellow earth in its water that the water itself has no color of its own. It runs thick and slow and heavy, the color of old honey, and for thousands of years it has been both the mother and the executioner of the people who live beside it. It has fed them. It has drowned them. It has changed its course across the flat plain more than 20 times, wandering hundreds of miles north or south like a sleeper turning over, and each time it moved it erased villages, farms, roads, whole counties, and left behind a silence that had to be filled again with new villages, new farms, new roads. The people who lived there learned something from that river that they never afterwards forgot. They learned that survival is a matter of organization, that water must be watched, banked, dredged, argued over, and that this cannot be done by one family alone. It takes many hands, it takes agreement, it takes someone to say when the digging begins. Out of that simple, muddy necessity, something enormous grew. Tonight we are going to follow it from the very beginning. From the first villages of painted pots on the lowest terraces, through the bronze halls of kings who asked burnt bones for advice, through the age when philosophers wandered from court to court, looking for a ruler who would listen, through the man who declared himself the first emperor and built an army of clay to guard him in the ground, through 400 years of Han, when silk began to travel west, and a Chinese envoy came home after 13 years to report that there were other worlds out there. Through the long centuries of division and the poetry of the Tang, through the printed books and paper money of the Song, through the Mongol horsemen who took the throne and the fleets that sailed to Africa and then were burned, all the way to a winter morning in 1912, when a boy of 6 sat on a throne in Beijing and a piece of paper was read aloud that ended 2,000 years of empire. It is a very long story, longer than any other continuous story we have. Egypt is older in places, Mesopotamia older still, but they became memories, dug out of the sand by strangers who could not read them without help. China simply kept going. The same characters that were scratched onto a turtle shell to ask a dead ancestor about the harvest can still, with effort, be read by a schoolchild in Shanghai. That thread was cut and knotted and frayed 100 times. It was never quite broken, so settle in. Let the lamp go low and let the river carry you. And if you feel like it, before you drift, leave a comment telling me where in the world you are listening from and what time it is where you are. I like to imagine all of us awake in different darknesses. Now, back to the river. Long before there were dynasties, before there were kings or writing or bronze, there were the terraces of the loess. Loess is a strange soil. It is not laid down by water but by wind, blown in fine yellow dust off the deserts of Central Asia over hundreds of thousands of years, piling up in some places to a depth of 200 feet. It is soft enough to dig with a wooden stick. It holds water like a sponge. It is astonishingly fertile because it is not soil that has been leached by rain for millennia but fresh mineral dust, renewed each year by more dust. On that yellow shelf of land, somewhere around 7,000 years before our own time, people stopped moving. They planted foxtail millet, a small hardy grain that will grow where wheat and rice will not. They kept pigs and dogs. They built round houses half sunk into the earth, with a floor a few feet below ground level so the winter wind passed over them, and a single central post holding up a thatched roof and a hearth in the middle where the smoke drifted up and blackened the reeds. In the village of Banpo, near the modern city of Xi'an, archaeologists uncovered one of these settlements almost whole. There were about 100 houses inside a defensive ditch. Outside the ditch was the cemetery, and beside it the kilns. The pottery from these villages is what makes them unforgettable. It is red and burnished, and painted in black with designs that have never entirely lost their power. Fish with human faces, whirling spirals, frogs and deer and abstract hooks that seem to be about to become something else. Whoever painted these bowls was not simply decorating them. There is a grammar there we cannot read. On one bowl from Bampo, a human face is drawn round and simple, with two fish hanging from the ears like ornaments, or perhaps swimming into the head. It has been reproduced 1,000,000 times since. Nobody knows what it meant. Further east, along the coast and into the flat lands, other people were doing something else. They were making pottery so thin it is called eggshell blackware. Cups on tall stems with walls, less than 1 millimeter thick, turned on a fast wheel, fired to a lustrous black, so fragile that they cannot have been used for daily drinking. These were objects made to show that they could be made. That is a very particular kind of society. Somebody had to be able to spend their days perfecting a skill that produced nothing edible. And somebody had to feed them while they did it. And somebody had to want the result badly enough to make that worthwhile. And in the wet green country near the mouth of the Yangtze, in the south, a different world entirely was taking shape. There they grew rice in flooded paddies, which is a harder and more social crop than millet, because paddies need shared water and shared walls. There they carved jade, not small ornaments but great discs and tall notched tubes, square outside and round inside, called kong. Jade is a stone so hard it cannot be cut with bronze, let alone stone. It has to be worn away with abrasive sand and string and patience, sometimes for months, for a single object. The jades of the Liangzhu culture are covered in faces so fine that some of the lines are less than 1/5 of a millimeter apart, carved without magnification 5,000 years ago, by people who left no writing at all. There was never one origin. That is the first thing to hold on to. The Chinese world did not begin at a single point and spread outwards. It began in many places at once, along many rivers, and only slowly did those places begin to borrow, trade, fight, and finally merge. Later historians would tidy all of this into a neat line of sage kings handing power to one another. The Yellow Emperor, who taught his people to make carts and boats and silk. Yao, who was so humble he passed over his own son. Shun, who was chosen for his virtue. And Yu the Great, the flood tamer. Yu is worth pausing on. Because of all the legendary figures, he is the one who says most about what these people valued. When the great flood came and the waters covered the land, Yu's father tried to dam them and failed and was executed for it. Yu took a different approach. He dredged. He cut channels and let the water run away to the sea. And he worked for 13 years, and the stories all insist on the same detail, that 3 times in those years he passed the door of his own house and heard his wife and child inside, and did not go in. He wore the skin off his hands. His legs became so worn that he walked with a shuffle ever afterwards, and there was a ritual walk in later centuries called the Step of Yu, an imitation of that limp. He was not rewarded for conquering anyone. He was rewarded for engineering, endurance, and the willingness to put the common work above his own family. And when he died, the throne did not pass to the most virtuous man available. It passed to his son. That, the old texts say, was the beginning of dynasty. They called it Xia. For a long time, nobody could prove that Xia had ever existed, and many scholars assumed it was a comfortable myth invented backwards to give the later dynasties a respectable ancestor. Then, in the middle of the 20th century, excavators near Luoyang uncovered a site called Erlitu. What they found was not a village. It was a city laid out with intention, with palace compounds built on rammed earth platforms, with a bronze foundry making objects no ordinary household could own, dating to roughly 1900 to 1500 years before the Common Era, exactly where and when the Xia were supposed to have been. Whether the people of Erlitou called themselves Xia, we will never know, because they left us no words. But somebody there was already doing the thing that would define Chinese kingship for the next 3,500 years. They were building on a platform, so that the ruler stood above the ordinary ground. The bronze they cast at Erlitou is thin and plain and slightly clumsy, the work of people still learned. Within a few centuries, that same craft would produce some of the most extraordinary metal objects ever made anywhere on Earth, and it would be made for one purpose above all others. Not for weapons, though there were weapons. Not for tools, though there were a few. It was made for feeding the dead. The dynasty that perfected this is the first one we can hear speaking, because it is the first that wrote. We call them the Shang, and for a very long time they too were considered half-legendary. Then, in the last years of the 19th century, a Chinese scholar named Wang Yirong fell ill with malaria and sent out for medicine. What came back from the apothecary included a traditional remedy called dragon bones, old bones ground into powder. Wang Yirong, who was a specialist in ancient inscriptions, looked at one of the fragments before it was ground and saw marks on it. Not cracks, characters, very old characters, but recognizably the ancestors of the writing he used every day. The bones were traced back to a village called Shaotun, near Anyang in the north of Henan province. Farmers there had been plowing them up for generations and selling them to druggists. When archaeologists finally arrived and began to dig properly, they found the last capital of the Shang, and beneath it, in pits, more than 150,000 pieces of inscribed bone and turtle shell. Here is what they were. A Shang king wanted to know something, whether to attack a neighboring people, whether the queen's childbirth would go well, whether the coming 10-day week would be free of misfortune, whether it would rain. He would put the question to his ancestors, because in Shang belief the dead did not depart, they ascended, and from up there they had influence over harvests and illness and war, and could be petitioned like officials. A diviner would take the flat underside of a turtle shell or the shoulder blade of an ox, prepared in advance with rows of hollows drilled into the back, and apply a red-hot point to a hollow. The bone would crack with a sharp sound. The shape of the crack was the answer. Then, and this is the part that gives us history, someone carved the question into the bone beside the crack. Sometimes the answer, sometimes later what actually happened. So we can read a king asking, on a specific day, whether the harvest will be good. We can read him asking whether his toothache is caused by a particular deceased ancestor being displeased. We can read a divination about a hunt, followed by a note recording that they caught 1 tiger, 40 deer, 164 foxes, and 159 hornless deer. We can read the king asking about the birth of a child by his consort, and the verdict that if the birth falls on a certain day, it will not be good, and then the terse addition afterwards that the birth did fall on that day, and it was not good, and it was a girl. The king's name was Wu Ding, and he reigned in the 13th century before the Common Era for perhaps 59 years, and he is the first ruler in Chinese history whose voice we can hear on subjects as small as his own teeth. His consort was a woman called Fu Hao, and in 1976 her tomb was found intact, the only unlooted royal Shang burial ever discovered. Inside were 468 bronze objects, more than 700 jades, nearly 7,000 cowrie shells, and 130 weapons. There were also 16 human beings buried with her and 6 dogs. The oracle bones tell us who she was, and they tell us something that startled everybody. She led armies. There are inscriptions asking whether Fu Hao should be sent against the Tu Fang, whether she should raise troops, How many? On one occasion, the number is 13,000, the largest troop levy recorded anywhere in the Shang archive. She commanded campaigns, she performed sacrifices, she held her own lands. And when she died before her husband, he went on asking the bones about her for years afterwards, and on at least one occasion he asked whether he should ritually marry her spirit to a long-dead former king, so that she would be looked after in the world above. That is the Shang, enormously sophisticated, technically brilliant, and permanently in conversation with the dead. Their bronzes are the proof of the technical brilliance. In the West, bronze was worked by beating and by lost wax casting, one object at a time. The Shang used piece molds. They made a clay model of the vessel, pressed sections of clay around it to take the impression, cut those sections away, carved the fine detail into the negative surfaces of the mold pieces from the inside, then reassembled the whole thing around, a shaved-down core, and poured. It is a system that allows detail of a fineness that beating cannot touch, and it allows repetition. Some Shang vessels weigh over 800 kilograms. To pour one, the foundry had to melt and deliver that much molten metal simultaneously from many crucibles into one mold without a pause, which means dozens of workers moving in exact coordination at furnace temperature. This was industry. And what came out of the molds were vessels for food and wine, covered in a dense, writhing surface of decoration. Spirals, hooks, dragons that dissolve into abstraction, and above all the tauti, a face that stares out from the belly of the vessel, with two great round eyes, horns, and no lower jaw. It appears on thousands of objects across centuries. Nobody has ever satisfactorily explained it. Later Chinese writers, already looking back at the Shang as ancient, said it was a glutton, a warning against greed. That is almost certainly a guess made long after the fact. The vessels were used to offer meat and millet wine to the ancestors on a strict rotating schedule, each ancestor receiving attention on his or her own day of the 10-day week, so that the ritual calendar of the royal house was in effect a permanent, unending dinner service for the dead. Generation stacked on generation, going back to the founder. The king was the only person who could reach the highest of them, and above them all sat a remote supreme power called Di, who did not accept sacrifice directly, and who could send drought or grant victory according to reasons of his own. The other proof, the darker one, is in the ground. Shang royal tombs are cross-shaped pits, some 50 feet deep, with ramps descending from 4 directions. They were emptied by looters long ago, but what the looters left behind were the bodies. Guards in the ramps with their weapons, charioteers with their horses and dismantled chariots, rows of kneeling skeletons. And in the sacrificial precinct near the temples at Anyang, pit after pit of decapitated men, mostly young, mostly buried in groups of 10, heads in one pit and bodies in another. Estimates run to more than 13,000 human sacrifices recorded or excavated across the Shang period. Many of them were prisoners taken from a people the oracle bones call the Qiang, who lived to the west and who were hunted for this purpose the way one might hunt deer, in numbers noted down afterwards with the same flat accounting. It is important not to soften this, and equally important not to make it the whole story. The Shang were not uniquely cruel by the standards of the second millennium before the Common Era, but they were unusually systematic, and their systems were written down, and so we can count. Their capital moved several times before settling at the place we call Yin, near modern Anyang, and there it stayed for the last 270 years or so of the dynasty. It was not a walled city in the later sense, but a sprawl of clan settlements, workshops, foundries, and royal compounds along the Huan River, perhaps 6 square miles of activity. Bone workshops turned out hairpins and arrowheads by the tens of thousands. Jade carvers worked stone brought from Xinjiang, 2,000 miles away, which tells you that long-distance exchange already existed, threading across deserts that nobody had yet named. And around the Shang in every direction were other peoples. Some paid tribute, some raided, some traded. The oracle bones are full of them, named and dismissed as Fang, meaning regions or borderlands. And one of these was modest, rather rustic people out to the west, in the Wei River Valley, who had learned bronze casting from the Shang and served them as a frontier guard. They were called the Zhou. In the 11th century before the Common Era, they came east. The story the Zhou told afterwards about what they did is one of the most consequential pieces of political thinking anyone has ever produced, and it began as an excuse. The last Shang king was named Di Xin, and in the Zhou account he was a monster. He was strong enough to fight wild beasts barehanded and clever enough to talk his way out of any criticism, and he used both gifts entirely for his own pleasure. He built a pool and filled it with wine, and hung the branches of the trees around it with roasted meat, and made naked men and women chase each other through it for his amusement. He invented a bronze cylinder that was laid over a fire, and made those who displeased him walk along it. He loved a woman named Daji who encouraged all of it, and when a loyal uncle reproached him, he said that he had heard a sage's heart had 7 openings, and had the man cut open to check. Almost none of this is likely to be true. It is the standard portrait of a last ruler, and it would be applied again and again over the next 3,000 years to every dynasty that fell, so consistently that Chinese historians eventually recognized the pattern themselves and said so out loud. A scholar of the Warring States period observed that Di Xin's wickedness was probably not as extreme as reported, and that this is why a gentleman hates to dwell downstream, because all the filth in the world flows to him. But the excuse mattered less than the principle the Zhou built on top of it. King Wu of Zhou marched east with an allied army and met the Shang host at a place called Muye. And the Shang army, which was largely made up of slaves and captives, is said to have turned its weapons around. Di Xin went back to his palace, put on his jade robes, and burned himself alive. And then the Zhou had a problem. They were a smaller, plainer people who had just destroyed a dynasty that had ruled for 600 years and claimed a unique line to the ancestors and to Di himself. On what possible grounds could an outsider take that? The answer they gave was Tianming, the mandate of heaven. Heaven, they said, is not the private ancestor of any family. Heaven cares about the people. Heaven grants the right to rule to whoever will govern well, and it withdraws that right from whoever governs badly. The Shang had held the mandate legitimately once. They had lost it through cruelty and neglect, and heaven had transferred it to the Zhou, who were merely the instrument. Look at what that does. It makes rule conditional. It makes the ruler answerable, not to an election, but to a standard, and it makes rebellion legitimate under specified circumstances. It also, and this is the uncomfortable half, makes success the evidence. If you win, heaven was with you. If a dynasty falls, it had already lost the mandate. Floods, earthquakes, comets, famines, all of these could be read as warnings that heaven was displeased. Every emperor for the next 3,000 years lived under that logic, and every rebel leader quoted it, and every historian used it to explain the past. The Duke of Zhou, brother of the conqueror, is the man usually credited with articulating it. He is also the man who did the harder work of holding the new realm together. King Wu died 2 years after the conquest, leaving a child heir, and the Duke took the regency, and his own brothers rose against him in alliance with the Shang remnant. It took 3 years of campaigning to put down. Afterwards, Rather than execute the Shang royal line, he settled them in their own state with their own rituals, so that the ancestors would keep receiving offerings and would not be turned loose to make trouble. And when the boy king came of age, the duke stepped down and handed him the government. Confucius, 500 years later, would dream about that man and consider it a bad sign when he stopped dreaming about him. The Zhou governed by planting relatives. They sent sons, brothers, cousins, and allied clans out to strategic places with a charge, a chariot, a body of troops, and a bronze vessel inscribed with the terms of the grant, and told them to build a walled town and rule the surrounding countryside. There were perhaps 70 such foundations. This is often called feudalism, and the comparison is not perfect, but it is not useless either. The lords owed military service and attendance at court and offerings at the ancestral temple. In return, they were left largely alone. For 250 years or so it worked. This is the period the later Chinese looked back on as the golden age of ritual order, when everyone knew their place and the world was calm. That was an idealization too. The bronze inscriptions from those centuries record land disputes, lawsuits, bribery, and constant campaigning against people on every frontier. But the center held. Then in 771, before the Common Era, it did not. The story again involves a woman, which should make us suspicious, and again the pattern is too neat. King Yu had a favorite concubine named Baosi, who never laughed. To amuse her, he lit the beacon fires that summoned his vassals to the defense of the capital. The lords came galloping from every direction, armor on, expecting invasion, and found nothing, and Baosi laughed at the sight of them milling about in confusion. He did it again and again, and when the western tribes actually came, the beacons were lit and nobody moved. What is certain is that the capital in the Wei Valley was sacked, that King Yu was killed, and that his heir was taken east to Luoyang under escort and set up again there. The dynasty survived in name for another 500 years. It never again had real power. What followed is the strangest and in some ways the most creative period in Chinese history. The Zhou king remained on his throne at Luoyang, the only man entitled to perform certain sacrifices, the fountain of all legitimacy, and completely unable to make anyone do anything. Around him, the 70 states that his ancestors had planted began to eat each other. By the end of the process, there would be 7 left. Historians divide these centuries into 2 halves, and the names both come from books. The first is called Spring and Autumn, after a terse chronicle of the state of Lu that Confucius was said to have edited. The second is called The Warring States, after a later compilation of political anecdotes. The division is roughly at 475 before the Common Era, and it marks a change of temperature. In the Spring and Autumn period, war was still, in a sense, a gentleman's occupation. Battles were fought by aristocrats in chariots, accompanied by small numbers of foot soldiers, and they were surrounded by ritual. There were rules. You did not attack a state in mourning for its ruler. You did not strike an opponent twice if he was already wounded. You did not take prisoners with gray hair. At the Battle of Hong in 638, the ruler of Song watched the army of Chu crossing a river in disorder, refused his advisor's plea to attack while they were vulnerable, waited until they had formed up properly, and was thoroughly beaten and mortally wounded. He defended himself afterwards by saying that a gentleman does not press an enemy in difficulty. He became a byword for foolishness. But the fact that he could say it at all tells you what the norms were. Since the king could not enforce order, the strongest lord took the job. He was called the Ba, usually translated as hegemon, and the first and greatest was Duke Huan of the eastern coastal state of Qi. He was not by nature an impressive man. He liked hunting, women, and food, and he once complained to his chief minister that he had 3 great faults and asked whether they would ruin him. The minister told him they would not, and that the only thing that ruins a ruler is failing to recognize talent, or recognizing it and not using it, or using it and not trusting it. That minister was Guanzhong, and he had once shot an arrow at Duke Huan and very nearly killed him, having served the duke's rival brother in the succession struggle. Huan wanted him executed. His advisor Bao Shuya told him that if he wanted merely to rule Qi, existing ministers would do, but if he wanted to be hegemon of the whole world, he needed Guanzhong. Huan swallowed it, met the man at the border, and made him chief minister on the spot. Guanzhong then rebuilt the state from the ground up. He organized the population into administrative units for taxation and military service. He established state monopolies on salt and on iron, the 2 commodities everybody must buy and nobody can make at home, and used the revenue to fund a standing force. He standardized weights, encouraged trade, and dredged waterways. Qi became rich, and then Qi became strong, and in 651 Duke Huan called the lords together at Quichu and had them swear a covenant that included, among other clauses, that they would not dam rivers to flood a neighbor, and would not withhold grain from a state suffering famine, and would honor the Zhou king. The king sent sacrificial meat to the meeting as a sign of approval, and told Huan he need not kneel to receive it. Huan knelt anyway. It was very good politics. The slogan of the hegemons was to honor the king and expel the barbarians, and there was substance to it. Nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples pressed on the northern states hard in these years. Qi campaigned against the wrong in the north and rescued the state of Yan, and when the state of Wei was overrun and its ruler killed, and, according to the horrified chronicle, eaten, it was Huan who resettled the survivors, all 730 of them, and gave them a new walled town. After Huan's death, which was squalid, involving palace intrigue and a corpse left unburied for 67 days while his sons fought over the succession, the hegemony passed around to Duke Wen of Jin, who had spent 19 years wandering in exile before coming to the throne at 62. To the kings of the great southern state of Chu, who spoke a different dialect, worshipped different gods, and had scandalized everyone by simply calling themselves kings, on equal terms with the Zhou. Chu was enormous, forested, humid, full of shamans and lacquer and strange spirits, and the northern states never quite knew what to make of it. In 606, a king of Chu marched to the Zhou border and asked insolently about the size and weight of the 9 sacred bronze cauldrons that were the physical symbol of the mandate. To ask the weight of the cauldrons became a permanent phrase for treason. And down at the very edge of the known world, in the wet rice country of the lower Yangtze, 2 more states rose late and violently: Wu and Yu. Their story is the one everybody in China still knows. The king of Wu defeated Yue and its king Gujian, and instead of killing him, took him captive and humiliated him. Gujian served as a stable hand. He tasted his conqueror's stool to diagnose an illness and predict recovery, which so impressed the king of Wu that he sent him home. Back in his own ruined state, Gujian slept on brushwood and hung a gall bladder above his seat, tasting its bitterness every day before meals so that he would never forget. He rebuilt for 20 years. He sent the king of Wu timber for grand palaces, to drain his treasury, and a beautiful woman named Shi to occupy his attention. And then, when Wu's army was away in the north pursuing glory, he attacked. The phrase for sleeping on brushwood and tasting gall is still used in Chinese to mean enduring hardship in the service of a long revenge. The rules of war had ended. It is somewhere in this transition that a treatise appeared which is still read in military academies. Its author is traditionally named Sun Wu, known as Sunzi, and the story of his interview with the king of Wu makes the point better than the text does. The king said he had read the book and asked whether the principles could be applied to anyone. Sunzi said yes. The king, amused, handed him 180 palace women and told him to drill them. Sunzi divided them into 2 companies, put the king's 2 favorite concubines in charge, explained the commands carefully, and gave the order. The women laughed. Sunzi said that if orders are unclear, the fault is the general's, and explained again. He gave the order. They laughed again. Sunzi said that if the orders are clear and are still not obeyed, the fault lies with the officers, and had the 2 favorites beheaded. The king begged him to stop. Sunzi replied that a general in the field is not bound by every word from his sovereign. The women drilled in perfect silence afterwards. The art of war contains almost no descriptions of battle. What it contains is an argument that war is a matter of calculation, deception, logistics, terrain, and above all the avoidance of unnecessary fighting. The supreme excellence, it says, is to break the enemy's resistance without fighting at all. Know the other and know yourself, and you will not be endangered in 100 engagements. It is a book written by someone who has watched the ritual world die and has decided to say plainly what has replaced it. He was not the only person watching. This age of collapsing order produced the greatest concentration of thinkers China would ever see, and they went from court to court, offering their diagnosis of what had gone wrong and their prescription for fixing it. The Chinese call it the 100 schools of thought. Almost everything in later Chinese intellectual life is a footnote to those 2 or 3 centuries. The most important of them was born in 551 before the Common Era, in the small, weak, ritually conservative state of Lu, to a family that had come down in the world. His father died when he was 3. He was, by his own account, poor and of low station as a young man, and so learned to do many menial things. His name was Kongqiu, and Latin missionaries 2,000 years later would render his honorific, Kongfuzi, as Confucius. He never held high office for long. He served as a minor official in Lu, rose briefly to a senior post, resigned or was squeezed out, and then spent 13 years traveling from state to state with a group of students, looking for a ruler who would employ him and put his ideas into practice. None ever did. He was mocked, threatened, and on one occasion besieged, and left without food for days. Once a hermit who heard who he was said of him, that this was the man who knows it cannot be done, and keeps on doing it. He came home in old age, taught, and died at 72, considering himself a failure. His teaching was not a religion. He was almost pointedly uninterested in metaphysics. Asked about serving the spirits, he said that if you cannot yet serve people, how can you serve spirits? Asked about death, he said that if you do not yet understand life, how can you understand death? What he cared about was conduct, and his central intuition was that a society is held together not primarily by law or force, but by people's internalized sense of how to behave toward one another. He built it out of a handful of ideas. Ren, usually translated as humanness or benevolence, the quality of a person who genuinely considers others. Li, ritual propriety, which covers everything from state sacrifices down to how you greet a neighbor, and which he understood as the outward shape that trains and expresses inward feeling, Xiao. Filial devotion, the debt to parents and ancestors, which he saw as the school in which every other loyalty is learned, and the Junzi, the gentleman, a term that had meant a nobleman by birth, and which he redefined to mean a person of cultivated character, regardless of birth. That redefinition was radical, and it is the seed of everything that came after, including, eventually, an examination system that would let a farmer's son govern a province. He was asked once whether there was a single word that could serve as a rule of conduct for life. He said there was, and the word was reciprocity, and then he stated it in the negative. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. He could be dry and he could be sharp. When a student asked how to serve a ruler, he said, do not deceive him, but withstand him to his face. When someone praised a man for thinking 3 times before acting, Confucius said twice is enough. He said he had never met anyone who loved virtue as much as they loved a pretty face. He described his own life in a single famous line, that at 15 he set his heart on learning, at 30 he stood firm, at 40 he had no doubts, at 50 he knew the mandate of heaven, at 60 his ear was obedient, and at 70 he could follow his heart's desire without overstepping the line. He wrote nothing that survives. What we have is the Analects, a collection of his sayings and conversations assembled by his students and their students after his death, uneven, repetitive, occasionally contradictory, and for 2,000 years the most influential book in East Asia. Against him and around him stood the others. There was Lao Tzu, the old master, who may never have existed. The story says he was a keeper of the archives who grew weary of the world and rode west on an ox, and at the frontier pass, the gatekeeper asked him to leave behind his wisdom before he vanished, and he wrote 5,000 characters and went on. That text is the Tao Te Ching, and it is the opposite of Confucius in almost every respect. Where Confucius wants effort, cultivation, ritual, and the improvement of society, the Tao Te Ching says that the more rules there are, the more thieves there will be, that the sage governs by emptying minds and filling bellies, that water is the most powerful thing in the world precisely because it yields, and that the way that can be spoken is not the eternal way. It recommends wu-wei, non-action, which does not mean laziness, but means not forcing, not straining against the grain of things. There was Zhuangzi, funnier and stranger, who wrote about a butterfly. He dreamed he was a butterfly, fluttering happily, entirely a butterfly, and when he woke he did not know whether he was a man who had dreamt he was a butterfly, or a butterfly now dreaming he was a man. When his wife died, and a friend found him drumming on a pot and singing and was shocked, Zhuangzi said that at first, of course, he had grieved, and then he had thought about it, and had seen that she had come out of the great process of change and had gone back into it, like the turning of the 4 seasons, and that to wail over it would be to show he understood nothing. Offered a high government post, he compared himself to a sacred tortoise kept in a box in a temple, and asked whether the tortoise would rather be honored dead or alive, and dragging its tail in the mud. He preferred the mud. There was Mosey, who came from the artisan class and argued for universal love, meaning that one should care for other people's parents as one cares for one's own, which Confucians found monstrous and unnatural. He attacked ritual, music, and elaborate funerals as expensive waste. He was fiercely against aggressive war, and his followers were organized almost as a military order, running to besieged cities to help them defend themselves, and they became the recognized experts in fortification. There is a story that Mosey walked 10 days and 10 nights to stop an attack on Song, and when he arrived, he sat down with the enemy's chief engineer, and they simulated the siege using belt buckles as walls and sticks as engines 9 times, and 9 times Mosey's defense held. The engineer said he knew one further method but would not say it. Mosey said he knew what it was and would not say it either. The attack was called off. The method was to kill Mosey, and Mosey's answer was that 300 of his disciples were already on the walls of Song with his instructions. Confucius himself had 2 great successors, and they disagreed with each other about the one question that matters most. Mencius came about a century after him and argued that human nature is fundamentally good. His demonstration is one of the most elegant arguments in ancient philosophy and takes about 4 sentences. Imagine, he says, that you suddenly see a small child about to fall into a well. Every person, without exception, will feel a start of alarm and distress, not because they hope to get in with the child's parents, not because they want a reputation among their neighbors, not because they dislike the sound of the crying. The feeling comes first, before any calculation. Therefore, the seed of compassion is in everyone, and it needs only to be cultivated, as a farmer cultivates a shoot. He warned about the cultivation as well, with a story about a man from Song who was worried that his crops were growing too slowly and went out and pulled each plant up a little to help. He came home exhausted and told his family he had been assisting the corn to grow. His son ran out to look, and the plants had all withered. Mencius was also politically the boldest of them. He told rulers to their faces that the people come first, the altars of the state second, and the sovereign last. Asked whether it was acceptable that a legendary king had been killed by his own subject, he replied that he had heard of the punishment of a solitary fellow, and had not heard of any regicide. That is to say, a ruler who has ceased to behave like a ruler has ceased to be one. Later emperors found this so uncomfortable that the founder of the Ming ordered the offending passages cut out of the text for use in schools. Zunzi, a generation or so later again, took the opposite view. Human nature, he said, is bad, and whatever is good in people is the result of deliberate effort. We are born wanting things, and wanting leads to competition, and competition to disorder. What saves us is ritual and education and law, which are inventions, like a straightening frame for warped wood or a whetstone for a blunt blade. He was still a Confucian, and he still thought people could be made good. But he thought it took work against the grain rather than with it. And he was contemptuous of superstition. When people pray for rain and it rains, he wrote, "What of it? It is the same as when they do not pray, and it rains anyway." Sacrifices and mourning rites, he thought, are beautiful and necessary human ceremonies, and the gentleman understands them as ceremonies, while the common people take them for dealings with spirits. The argument between Mencius and Zunzi is the argument between 2 views of politics that has never been settled anywhere. Mencius won the orthodoxy and became the second sage. But 2 of Zunzi's students went further than he had ever intended, decided that if nature is bad, then ritual and education are far too slow, and reached for the law and the axe instead. One of them was Li Si. The other was a stammering prince named Han Fei, whose writings are the sharpest statement of the position ever made, and who was forced to drink poison in a Qin prison by his old classmate. And there were the men who thought all of this was sentimental nonsense. They are called the legalists, and they won. Their argument was brutally simple. Human beings are motivated by the pursuit of benefit and the avoidance of harm. That is not a moral failing. It is a fact, like weight. Therefore, a state should not waste time trying to make people virtuous. It should make the things it wants people to do profitable, and the things it does not want them to do painful. And it should apply this with absolute consistency to everyone, high and low, without exception and without mercy, so that the law becomes as predictable as gravity. Rewards should be generous. Punishments should be severe out of all proportion, precisely so that they rarely need to be used. The man who put this into practice was Shang Yang, and the state he did it in was Qin. Qin sat in the far west, in the old Zhou homeland in the Wei Valley, and the other states regarded it as barely Chinese, a half-barbarian frontier place of horsemen and rough manners. It had land, it had horses, it had defensible mountain passes, And in 361, before the Common Era, it had a young ruler who was ambitious and who advertised publicly for talent. Shang Yang came from Wei, having failed to interest anyone else. His first 2 interviews with the Duke of Qin went badly, because he talked about the way of the ancient sage kings, and the Duke fell asleep. On the 3rd, he talked about how to make a state powerful within a single lifetime. And the Duke sat forward and they talked for days. Then Shang Yang did something that tells you everything about his method. Before publishing his new laws, he had a pole set up at the south gate of the capital and announced that anyone who carried it to the north gate would receive 10 pieces of gold. Nobody moved, because it was absurd. He raised it to 50. One man, presumably for a joke, picked up the pole and carried it across the city, and was immediately paid 50 pieces of gold in public. Then the laws were published. The lesson was not about the pole. The lesson was that the state means exactly what it says. The laws abolished the hereditary aristocracy's privileges. Rank would now be earned by military merit, and merit was counted in enemy heads brought back from the field, and a nobleman with no heads had no rank. Land was made privately saleable, breaking the old estates. The population was organized into groups of 5 and 10 households, mutually responsible, so that failure to denounce a crime was punished as severely as the crime. Fathers and adult sons were forbidden to live in the same household, which doubled the number of taxable units at a stroke. Weights, measures, and axle widths were standardized. Farming and soldiering were the only honorable occupations. Merchants and scholars were regarded as parasites. When the crown prince broke the law, Shang Yang said that the difficulty of governing lies in the great and not the small, and since he could not punish the heir apparent, he punished the prince's 2 tutors instead. One had his nose cut off. The law applied. Qin became terrifyingly efficient. It also became a place nobody wanted to visit, and when the old duke died, the crown prince came to the throne and remembered. Shang Yang fled and tried to take a room at an inn on the road, and the innkeeper told him that under the laws of Lord Shang, it was a capital offense to lodge a man without papers. He is said to have sighed and observed that he had not known how far the thing would go. He was caught and torn apart by chariots, and his family was exterminated. His laws were kept. Meanwhile, the character of war had changed completely. The chariot aristocracy was gone. Armies were now enormous conscript infantry masses, hundreds of thousands strong, equipped with crossbows, whose bronze trigger mechanisms were machined to interchangeable tolerances, campaigning for months at a time, supported by state granaries and roads. In the north, King Wuling of Zhao noticed that the nomads on his border were beating him because they fought from horseback in trousers, while his men fought from chariots in robes, and he ordered his court to adopt barbarian dress and mounted archery. There was outrage. He did it anyway. It worked. Casualty figures from these wars are almost certainly exaggerated and are still appalling. The worst was at Changping in 260, when Qin faced Zhao, the last state strong enough to stop it. Qin engineered the replacement of Zhao's cautious old general with a young man who wanted to attack, lured his army into a trap, cut its supply line, and starved it for 46 days until the soldiers were eating each other. When they surrendered, the Qin commander Bai Qi had them buried alive, all of them. The traditional figure is 400,000. Whatever the true number, Zhao never recovered. And after that the outcome was only a matter of time. Into this, in 259 before the Common Era, a boy was born in the state of Zhao, where his father was living as a hostage. His name was Zheng. There were rumors, which the historian Sima Qian recorded with evident relish, that his real father was not the Qin prince at all, but a fabulously wealthy merchant named Lu Buwei. who had spotted the obscure hostage prince as a commercial opportunity, financed his return to Qin, maneuvered him onto the throne, and given him a favorite concubine who may already have been pregnant. Lu Bui became chancellor, and in effect, the regent of the young king. Zheng took power in his own right at 22, in a coup within a coup, putting down an armed revolt led by a man who had been introduced into the palace as a false eunuch and had fathered 2 children by the queen mother. He had the man torn apart, the children killed, his mother placed under house arrest, and Lu Bui dismissed and eventually driven to suicide. Then he turned outward. In 25 years, Qin destroyed the 6 remaining states, one after another, by a combination of overwhelming force, systematic bribery of enemy ministers, and diplomacy that isolated each victim before it was attacked. Han fell in 230, Zhao in 228, Wei in 225. Shu, the great southern giant, took 600,000 men and 2 campaigns and fell in 223. Yan in 222, whose prince had already made a famous attempt to prevent all this by sending an assassin named Jing Ke to the Qin court with a map rolled around a poisoned dagger, an attempt that ended with the king of Qin running round a pillar, trying to draw his sword, which was too long, while his courtiers, forbidden by law to carry weapons in the audience hall, stood and watched, and Qi, which had made a deal and disarmed and been guaranteed safety, in 221. There was nothing left. For the first time, one man ruled the entire Chinese world. He decided that no existing title was adequate. King was what the rulers of the states he had just destroyed had called themselves. So he took 2 words out of the deepest layer of myth, Huang and Di, which belonged to the legendary sovereigns and divine powers of the beginning of things, and put them together. Huangdi. We translate it as emperor. He was Shi Huangdi, the first emperor, and he expected his successors to be numbered simply as second, third, and onward for 10,000 generations. He then set about erasing the world he had conquered. The old states were abolished entirely. In their place came 36 commanderies, subdivided into counties, each with a civil administrator, a military commander, and an inspector, all appointed by the center, all salaried, none hereditary, all reporting separately so that they watched one another. That structure, invented in one decision, is essentially how China has been administered ever since. The aristocratic families of the conquered states, 120,000 households of them, were uprooted and moved to the capital at Xianyang, where they could be watched. The weapons of the empire were collected and melted down and cast into 12 colossal bronze figures, each said to weigh many tons, set up in the palace courtyard. The walls that the old states had built against each other were torn down, and the walls they had built against the northern nomads were joined and extended by conscript labor into one continuous barrier running for thousands of miles across the top of the empire. It was rammed earth, not the stone battlements that tourists photograph today, and those came much later, but the line was drawn then, and it has stayed roughly there ever since. Weights and measures were standardized. Axle widths were standardized, so that carts made anywhere could run in the ruts of the imperial highways. And those highways, straight, ditched, and tree-lined, ran out from the capital in every direction for many thousands of miles. Coinage was standardized into a round bronze coin with a square hole, a shape that would be used continuously for the next 2,000 years. And the writing was standardized. This is the quiet one, and it may be the most important thing he ever did. The states had drifted apart in their scripts over 5 centuries. His chancellor Li Si issued a unified set of character forms, and everything else was suppressed. From that point on, a man from the far south and a man from the far north might be unable to exchange a single spoken sentence, and could write to each other without difficulty. Spoken Chinese is a family of languages. Written Chinese was made one by decree, and that single fact has held the country together through every subsequent collapse. Li Si also proposed something else. In 213, at a banquet, a scholar praised the ancient system of granting lands to relatives and criticized the commandery system as a departure from the ways of antiquity. Li Si lost his temper. He argued that scholars who used the past to criticize the present were poisoning the state, and proposed that all histories except the annals of Qin, and all copies of the classics of poetry and documents, and all writings of the 100 schools be surrendered and burned. Books on medicine, divination, agriculture, and forestry were exempted, as were the copies held in the imperial library. Anyone who discussed the forbidden books in public would be executed. Anyone who used the past to criticize the present would be executed along with his family. Officials who knew and did not report would receive the same punishment. The emperor approved it. The following year, enraged by 2 alchemists who had taken his money and then fled while mocking him, he ordered an investigation of the scholars in the capital, and the men denounced one another, and 460 were buried alive. The burning of the books and the burying of the scholars became the permanent charge against him, repeated for 2,000 years. The damage was real, though probably less total than the tradition claims, since much was memorized, hidden in walls, and reconstructed afterwards. But it fixed his reputation. He was the tyrant. He was the man who tried to begin history over again with himself. He was also, by the end, terrified of dying. He had survived at least 3 assassination attempts. He slept in a different one of his 270 palaces each night, connected by covered walkways so that nobody could see where he went, and it was a capital offense to reveal his location. He sent expeditions east across the sea, in search of the islands of the immortals and the herb that grants eternal life. One such expedition, under a man named Shu Fu, took 3,000 young men and women and never came back, and Japanese legend says they landed there. He took pills prepared by his alchemists, and it is entirely possible that those pills, which very likely contained cinnabar, which is mercury sulfide, are what killed him. And all the while, at Mount Li near his capital, 700,000 conscripts were building him somewhere to lie. Sima Qian, writing a century later, described what was inside: a model of the empire with the rivers and the seas rendered in flowing mercury, made to circulate by machinery. The heavens above set with pearls. Crossbows rigged to fire automatically at intruders. Whale oil lamps that would burn for centuries. The workmen who knew the secret of the inner passages sealed inside. The concubines who had borne no children entombed. Trees and grass planted over the top so that it would look like a hill. Modern soil surveys of the unopened mound have found mercury concentrations far above the natural background, distributed in a pattern that does not look accidental. The tomb has never been excavated. The Chinese authorities have decided sensibly to wait until the technology exists to open it without destroying it. What was excavated by accident in March of 1974 was something Sima Qian never mentioned at all. Farmers digging a well about a mile east of the mound struck fired clay. What they had found was a pit, and in the pit, in ranks, in trenches, with timber roofs that had burned and collapsed on top of them, was an army. Infantry in 11 columns, archers kneeling in the front, chariots with 4 horse teams, cavalry with their mounts. Roughly 8,000 figures across 3 pits, life-sized and hollow above the waist, and solid-legged so they would stand, and every face is different. The bodies were mass-produced from molds in a small number of standard types, but the heads were finished individually. with ears, moustaches, hairstyles, expressions. Some are young and smooth. Some are middle-aged and heavy-jawed. Some look bored. They were painted in bright colors, pink flesh, green and red and purple armor lacing, and the pigment flaked off within minutes of exposure to the dry air when the first ones came out, so that we mostly see them gray. Their weapons were real, and the bronze arrowheads and sword blades came out of the ground still sharp, after 2,200 years, because the surface had been treated with chromium in a process nobody has fully explained. Behind them, in other pits, were bronze cranes and swans and geese by a modeled watercourse, and terracotta acrobats, and strongmen, and civil officials, with writing knives and whetstones at their belts, and half-sized bronze chariots with silver and gold fittings and umbrellas that tilt. He wanted the whole world underground with him, and he had the means to order it and the state to deliver it. And that is really the point of the terracotta army. Not the artistry, extraordinary as it is. The organization. Somebody had to source the clay, build the kilns, train the sculptors, supply the food, keep the records, and check the work. And we know they checked, because the figures are stamped on the underside with the names of the foremen responsible, 85 of them, so that faults could be traced back. The first emperor died in 210 on an eastern tour, far from the capital, in the middle of the summer heat. His chief eunuch Zhao Gao and his chancellor Li Zi decided to conceal the death until they reached home. They kept the corpse in its curtained carriage, brought meals in as usual, and had officials make their reports to the closed curtain. As the days passed and the smell became impossible, they ordered a cart of salted fish to travel alongside so that nobody would ask questions. They also forged the succession. The emperor's chosen heir, a decent and rather Confucian man named Fusu, who had been exiled to the northern frontier for criticizing the burial of the scholars, received a letter ordering him to kill himself. He did at once, weeping over the objections of the general beside him, who suspected forgery. The throne went instead to a younger, weaker son. He lasted 3 years. The empire that was meant to last 10,000 generations collapsed within 4 years of its founder's death, and it collapsed from the bottom. In the summer of 209, a party of 900 conscripts was marching to a garrison post on the northern frontier when heavy rain washed out the roads. Under Qin law, arriving late for a military posting was punishable by death. 2 of the junior officers among them, Chen Sheng and Wu Guang, worked out that they were going to be executed either way, and one of them asked the question that has echoed through Chinese history ever since. Are kings and nobles given their positions by birth? They rose. Within weeks there were risings everywhere, because the whole country was full of men in exactly the same position, and the Qin state, having abolished the aristocracy and put everyone under the same merciless code, had also given everyone the same grievance. Chen Sheng was dead within 6 months, killed by his own charioteer. It did not matter. The fire was lit. Out of the confusion, 2 men rose above the rest. Xiang Yu was an aristocrat of Chu, a giant of a man said to be able to lift a bronze cauldron, an unstoppable battlefield commander who had never lost an engagement. At the Battle of Julu, he crossed a river, sank his boats, smashed his cooking pots, and burned his shelters, leaving his men 3 days of rations and no way back, and destroyed a Qin army several times his size, while 8 allied armies watched from behind their palisades, and then came to him afterwards on their knees. Liu Bang was a village headman from Pei, of peasant stock, fond of wine and women, notoriously coarse, entirely uninterested in ceremony. He had once, according to the histories, urinated into the ceremonial cap of a visiting scholar. He was not much of a general. He lost most of the battles he personally fought. He was, however, extraordinarily good at three things. He listened to advice. He kept the loyalty of men far more talented than himself. And he understood that what wins a country is not the destruction of armies, but the government of people. When Liu Bang reached the Qin capital first, and the last Qin ruler surrendered to him, he did not loot the palaces. He called together the elders of the district and told them that they had suffered enough under the harsh laws of Qin, and that he was abolishing all of them and replacing them with 3 articles. Anyone who kills shall die. Anyone who wounds or robs shall be punished accordingly. Everything else is repealed. The relief was total. When Xiang Yu arrived a little later, he massacred the surrendered garrison, executed the Qin heir, looted everything, and burned the palaces, and the fires are said to have burned for 3 months. The war between them lasted 4 years, and Liu Bang lost almost continuously. He was beaten at Pengcheng so badly that he threw his own children out of the carriage to lighten it during the escape. And his charioteer kept stopping to pick them up again. He was wounded by a crossbow bolt in the chest at Guangwu, and knowing that if his men saw it they would break, bent down and grabbed his foot and shouted that the bandit had hit him in the toe. But he had Xiao He organizing his supplies and his conscription in the rear, tirelessly for years. He had Zhang Liang, a strategist of aristocratic family, who had once tried to assassinate the first emperor with a hired strongman and a heavy iron hammer. And he had Han Xin, one of the greatest field commanders in Chinese history, a man who, as a youth, had been so poor he was fed by an old washerwoman, and who had once been made to crawl between a bully's legs in the marketplace rather than fight, because he judged the fight not worth it. Xiang Yu had Fan Zeng and stopped listening to him and drove him away. At the end, in 202, Xiang Yu was surrounded at Geisha with a few thousand men. In the night, he heard the songs of his native Chu being sung from every side of the encircling camp, and understood that Chu had gone over. The phrase for hearing the songs of Chu on all sides is still Chinese for hopeless isolation. He drank in his tent and sang a song of his own, that his strength had uprooted mountains and his spirit had covered the age. But the times were against him, and his horse would not gallop, and what could he do about his lady Yu? She is said to have danced and then killed herself, so that he would not have to think about her. He broke out with 28 riders, fought until he had killed a great many men, reached the river where a boatman waited to carry him to safety in the south, and refused to go, saying that he had crossed with 8,000 sons of the east and could not face their fathers alone. He recognized an old comrade among the enemy cavalry and told him there was a price on his head, and that he might as well do him the favor and cut his own throat. Liu Bang became emperor, and the dynasty he founded is called Han, and it lasted, with one interruption, for 400 years. The Chinese majority ethnicity still calls itself the Han people. The Chinese written characters are still called Han characters in China and Japan and Korea alike. When people speak of what it means to be Chinese, they are, whether they know it or not, referring to those 4 centuries. What Han did was to fuse the 2 things that had been at war. It kept the Qin machinery, the commanderies, the counties, the standardized measures, the salaried officials, the law. And it dressed that machinery in Confucian clothing, so that the emperor was not a naked engine of coercion, but the son of heaven, the moral center of the world, whose virtue caused the seasons to turn properly and the grain to grow. Liu Bang himself had no time for scholars, but a Confucian named Shu Sun Tong persuaded him to let him design a court ceremonial. The first time it was performed, with the officials filing in order of rank, prostrating in unison, and nobody drunk or shouting or drawing a sword to carve the pillars as had happened before. The emperor sat back and said that only now did he realize how splendid it was to be an emperor. The early Han emperors and the formidable widows who ruled for them governed lightly. Taxes were cut to 1/30th of the harvest, punishments were softened, and the mutilating penalties of Qin were abolished after a famous incident in which a girl named Tiying petitioned the throne on behalf of her father, offering to become a state slave in his place, and pointed out that a man whose nose is cut off can never have it back, so that even if he repents, there is no road for him to return. The state granaries filled. The strings on which the coins were kept, according to one account, rotted through from lying untouched, and then came a man who spent all of it. Emperor Wu came to the throne in 141 at the age of 15 and reigned for 54 years, which no Chinese ruler would beat for 18 centuries. He was restless, superstitious, ferociously intelligent, cruel, and enormously consequential. Under him, the empire roughly doubled. He pushed south, absorbing the whole coast down to what is now Vietnam. He pushed into the southwest, into the mountains of Yunnan. He pushed northeast into Korea, and above all, he attacked the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were a confederation of nomadic horsemen on the steppe to the north, and they were the permanent problem of Chinese history in its first great form. They had humiliated the founder of the Han, trapping Liu Bang and his army for 7 days on a frozen hill at Baiding until he bought his way out. For 70 years afterwards, the Han had paid them off, with silk and grain and imperial princesses sent north as brides, a policy politely called harmonious kinship and understood by everyone as tribute. Emperor Wu ended it. He sent enormous cavalry armies deep into the steppe, hundreds of thousands of horses, campaigns that lasted seasons and crossed deserts. He found brilliant young generals, notably Wei Qing, who had been born a slave, and Wei Qing's nephew Wo Chubing, who led a raid at 18 and was dead of illness at 23, and had by then driven the Xiongnu out of the whole northwestern corridor. He also lost armies. He bankrupted the treasury and had to invent new revenue, reviving the state monopolies on salt and iron, and adding one on liquor, debasing the coinage, and selling offices and pardons. But the campaigns had a side effect that outlasted everything else. Before the war began, Emperor Wu had heard that a people called the Yuezhi had been driven west by the Xiongnu and might make an ally. In 138, he sent an envoy named Zhang Qian to find them. Zhang Qian was captured by the Xiongnu almost immediately and held for 10 years. He married there and had a son. Then he escaped, and instead of going home, he continued west, because that was his mission. He crossed the mountains, reached the Yuezhi in what is now Afghanistan, found that they had settled down comfortably and had no interest in revenge, and started back. He was captured again. He escaped again during a succession dispute. He reached the Han capital in 125, 13 years after he had left, with one companion and his Xiongnu wife. He had failed, and he brought back the most valuable intelligence anyone had ever carried into China. There were, he reported, great civilizations out there. Fergana, with horses that sweated blood, and were far bigger than anything the Han had. Bactria, with markets. Parthia, with cities of tens of thousands, and a written script and coins stamped with the king's face. India, somewhere to the south, which he had not visited but had heard about. And in a market in Bactria, he had seen bamboo and cloth from the Chinese southwest, which meant there was already a route he did not know about. The emperor was fascinated, mostly by the horses. He sent embassies, and then, when Fergana refused to sell and killed his envoys, he sent an army 4,000 miles to take them by force, which after one catastrophic failure and a second attempt with 60,000 men it did. But the traffic that opened up was not really about horses. Silk went west. It went from hand to hand, across the oasis cities of the Tarim Basin, Dunhuang and Lulan and Kashgar, over the Pamirs, through Parthian middlemen who took care to keep the two ends of the chain from meeting, to Rome, where by the 1st century it was expensive enough that the Senate debated banning it on the grounds that it drained the treasury and that a garment through which the body could be seen was not decent. Pliny complained that the empire was spending 100 million sesterces a year on Eastern luxuries. The Romans thought silk grew on trees. The Chinese guarded the secret of the silkworm for centuries with the death penalty. Other things came the other way. Grapes and alfalfa, which Zhang Qian brought seeds of, walnuts, pomegranates, sesame, cucumbers. Glass, which China never much bothered to make well because it had porcelain. And later, walking slowly along the same roads with monks and merchants, a religion out of India, which would change the country more deeply than any of the trade goods. That was still centuries off. What Emperor Wu did in his own lifetime, apart from war, was to fix Confucianism as the state creed. In 136, he established chairs for the 5 classics at court. In 124, he founded an imperial academy with 50 students, which within 2 centuries had 30,000. And he ruled that officials should be recommended and examined on the basis of learning and character. That is the thin end of an enormous wedge. Over the following 1,000 years, it would grow into the examination system, the most distinctive institution China ever produced, in which the government of a quarter of humanity was handed to men selected by written examination on poetry, history, and moral philosophy. The other thing Emperor Wu produced indirectly was history itself. There was a court astronomer named Sima Tan, whose family had been court recorders for generations, and who had begun a project to write the entire history of the world from the beginning to his own day. He died before he could finish, and on his deathbed he took his son's hand and wept and made him promise to complete it. The son was Sima Qian. In 99, a Han general named Li Ling, with 5,000 infantry, was surrounded by a Xiongnu force of 80,000, fought a retreat over 8 days, killed many times his own number, ran out of arrows and surrendered. At court, everyone condemned him. Sima Qian, asked his opinion by the emperor, defended him, pointing out what he had achieved with what he had, and suggesting he might have surrendered intending to escape later. The emperor took this as an implied criticism of another general, who was his brother-in-law, and had Sima Qian condemned to death. There were 2 ways to avoid execution. One was to pay an enormous fine. Sima Qian could not. The other was castration, which was considered so disgraceful that a man of honor was expected to choose death instead. He chose to live because of the promise to his father. He wrote about it afterwards in a letter to a friend, in one of the most naked pieces of prose in the language. He said that a man has only one death, and that death may be heavier than Mount Tai, or lighter than a goose feather, depending on what it is used for. He said that he had been made a laughing stock, that he could not think about it without the sweat soaking his back, that he did not dare visit his parents' graves. And he said that all the great works of the past were written by men who had been thwarted, blinded, imprisoned, exiled, and that they wrote because they had something they could not express any other way. He would finish the book and hide it in a famous mountain so that it would reach the right people later. The result is the Shiji, the records of the grand historian, 130 chapters, 500,000 characters. It covers 2,500 years, and it invented a structure that every subsequent official history would copy. Annals of the rulers, chronological tables, treatises on subjects like ritual, music, calendars, rivers and canals and the economy, hereditary houses, And then, at the end and taking up the largest part, biographies of generals and ministers, but also of assassins, comedians, doctors, diviners, wandering knights, harsh officials, and rich merchants. He is a real historian in a sense that would not appear in Europe for a very long time. He compares sources. He says when he does not know. He traveled to the places he wrote about and talked to the descendants. He includes material that damages the reigning dynasty and its founder, and material that damages the reigning emperor, and his portrait of Emperor Wu, chasing immortality and being fleeced by charlatans, was so unflattering that the relevant chapter may have been removed and replaced later. And at the end of each chapter, he steps forward in his own voice, beginning with the phrase the grand historian says, and tells you what he thinks. He thought a great deal about whether heaven is just. Standing over the story of two brothers who starved themselves to death rather than serve an unrighteous ruler, while a famous bandit lived to a great age surrounded by his followers, he asked the question directly: is this so-called way of heaven right or wrong? He does not answer it. It is worth stopping the march of emperors for a while and looking at what ordinary life in the Han actually looked like, because we know, in unusual detail, and because it is a restful thing to imagine, most people were farmers, and most farmers lived in villages of a few dozen households on the North China Plain, in houses of rammed earth with tiled or thatched roofs and a courtyard. They grew millet in the north and rice in the south, with wheat spreading as milling improved. They kept pigs, and the character for family is still a pig under a roof. They wore hemp. Silk was for those who could afford it, and sumptuary law tried, with limited success, to stop merchants from wearing it. The tools they used were better than anything in the world at the time. Han farmers had a moldboard plow with an iron share, which turns the soil over instead of merely scratching it, and which Europe would not have in a usable form for another 1,000 years. They had the seed drill, sowing in straight rows at controlled depth, which meant far less waste and easier weeding. They had a rotary winnowing fan with a crank for separating grain from chaff, which reached Europe in the 18th century and was regarded there as a novelty. They had the horse collar, which rests on the shoulders rather than the windpipe, and lets an animal pull several times more weight without choking. They had the wheelbarrow and a foot-operated tilt hammer for hulling grain, and water-powered bellows for iron furnaces. That last one matters more than it sounds. Han China produced cast iron in quantity, in blast furnaces, because their clays and their bellows let them reach the temperatures required, and because they had learned to decarburize it afterwards to make it workable. Europe did not manage sustained cast iron production until the 15th century. Han iron went into plowshares, cooking pots, nails, chains, and swords, and the state ran it as a monopoly with 49 foundries, which was a matter of enormous political controversy. We know it was controversial because we have the transcript of the debate. In 81, before the Common Era, a formal court conference was held on whether to keep the salt and iron monopolies, and someone wrote it down. The government side argued that the monopolies funded the frontier defenses and stabilized prices, and that without them, the state would have to tax the peasantry directly. The scholars argued that the state should not be in trade at all, that the monopoly iron was badly made and expensive, and sold in sizes that did not suit small farms, and that a government which competes with its own people for profit has abandoned virtue. The liquor monopoly was abolished, the others stayed. City life was concentrated in Chang'an, the capital, which was a rectangle of rammed earth walls about 6 miles around, with 12 gates, each with 3 carriageways. The central lane of each avenue was reserved for the emperor. Inside were two great markets, the eastern and the western, opened and closed by drum and gong, with rows of shops grouped by trade, and government inspectors checking weights. Outside the walls, the imperial parks stretched for miles, stocked with animals sent as tribute from the ends of the world. And in the households of the wealthy, we have their possessions, because they were buried with them. The tomb of the Marquis of Dai at Mawangdui, sealed in about 168 before the Common Era and opened in 1972, contained the woman herself, so well preserved by an airtight nest of coffins packed in charcoal and clay that her skin was still elastic and her joints still bent. In her stomach were 138 melon seeds, eaten a couple of hours before she died of a heart attack in her early 50s. Beside her were lacquer dishes with the food still in them, labeled bamboo slips listing the contents of every box, silk garments including a plain gauze robe that weighs 49 grams, a set of medical and philosophical texts on silk that included 2 copies of the Tao Te Ching, older than any previously known, and a painted silk banner showing the underworld below, the human world in the middle, and the heavens above, with the dead woman making her way upward, leaning on a stick. They believed the soul was double. One part, the Po, stayed with the body in the ground and needed food and comfort and company. The other, the Hun, rose. That is why the tombs are furnished like houses, with lamps and stoves and latrines, and models of granaries and wells and dogs and dancing girls, and why the ceilings of the finest are painted with the sun and the moon and the constellations. Which brings us to the fall, because the Han fell twice. The first collapse came from within the palace. By the end of the 1st century before the Common Era, the emperors were young, short-lived, and dominated by their mothers' families. The most successful of those families produced a man named Wang Mang, who was, by every account, exemplary. He was modest, frugal, learned, generous, endlessly correct. He gave away his salary in famines. He had his own son executed for killing a slave. He was, in the eyes of the Confucian establishment, the perfect minister, and they pressed honors on him. And in the year 9 of the Common Era, he took the throne himself and declared a new dynasty called Xin, meaning new. Then he tried to remake the world according to the classics. He nationalized the land and forbade its sale, aiming to redistribute it to peasants as he believed the sage kings had done. He abolished slavery. He introduced state loans at low interest, price stabilization boards, and new taxes on hunters, fishermen, silk weavers, and craftsmen. He reformed the currency repeatedly, introducing 28 denominations at one point, including cowrie shells and tortoise shell and spade-shaped bronze on antiquarian grounds, and made possession of gold illegal. It was chaos. The land reform was unenforceable and was withdrawn within 3 years. The currency reforms destroyed confidence and prices collapsed and then soared. And then, in the middle of it, the Yellow River broke its banks and changed course, moving its mouth hundreds of miles, drowning an entire province and displacing millions of people who had nowhere to go and nothing to eat. Out of that flood zone came the rebellion that destroyed him. They were peasants, and they painted their eyebrows red so that they could tell each other apart in a fight, and they are called the Red Eyebrows. Wang Mang's armies failed. When the rebels finally broke into Chang'an, he retreated to a tower on an island in the palace lake, and there, according to the account, he sat holding the imperial seal, dressed in ceremonial purple, turning his mat to face the correct astronomical direction as the hour changed, and saying that heaven had given him the virtue, so what could the rebels do to him? They killed him and cut off his head, and it was kept in the imperial armory for the next 200 years. A member of the old Han house was restored, and the dynasty resumed at a new capital at Luoyang, and that second half is called the Eastern Han. It produced a good deal. It produced Ban Zhao, the first woman historian in China, who completed her dead brother's history of the Western Han, tutored the empress, and wrote a book of instructions for her daughters that has been read ever since with very mixed feelings, since it argues both for women's submission and, at some length, for their education. It produced Zhang Heng, who was an astronomer, mathematician, poet, and engineer. He built a water-powered armillary sphere that turned with the sky. He calculated a value for pi, and in the year 132, he presented an instrument for detecting distant earthquakes, a bronze vessel about 6 feet across, with 8 dragon heads around the rim, each holding a bronze ball and 8 open-mouthed toads below. When the earth moved, one ball dropped into one toad's mouth with a clang, indicating the direction. The court dismissed it as a toy until a ball dropped one day, with no tremor felt in the capital, and several days later, a rider arrived from 400 miles to the northwest, reporting an earthquake. And it produced paper. Kai Lun, a court eunuch, is credited in 105 with presenting a method for making a cheap writing sheet from tree bark, hemp waste, old rags and fishing nets, macerated, suspended in water, lifted on a screen, and dried. He probably improved an existing process rather than inventing it, since fragments of earlier paper exist. It does not matter. Before this, people wrote on silk, which was expensive, or on bundles of bamboo slips, which were heavy. There is a story of a scholar whose memorial to the throne required 2 men to carry it. Paper changed what a civilization could remember, and how many people could take part in remembering it, and it took 1,000 years to reach Europe. But the Eastern Han rotted the same way as the first, only faster, and with an extra ingredient. Power at court split 3 ways between the great landowning families who supplied the empresses, the officials and scholars of the bureaucracy, and the eunuchs who staffed the inner palace and had the emperor's ear because they were the only adult males allowed near the harem. The eunuchs won, twice, in purges that killed or banned hundreds of officials, in what is called the partisan prohibitions. Meanwhile, the land was concentrating. Great estates swallowed small farms, and the families who owned them evaded tax and raised private militias. Registered population fell, not because people died, but because they vanished into the shelter of these estates as dependents. And then, in 184, a religious movement swept the countryside. Its leader was a faith healer named Zhang Jue, who preached a Taoist doctrine of the way of great peace, treated the sick with charmed water and public confession, and organized his hundreds of thousands of followers into 36 regional divisions. They rose on a single day across 8 provinces, wearing yellow cloth on their heads, and their slogan was that the blue heaven is dead, the yellow heaven will be established, and in the year of Jiazi there will be great fortune under heaven. The Yellow Turban Rebellion was crushed within a year. Crushing it required the court to give provincial governors and generals the authority to raise their own armies. And once they had those armies, they did not give them back. The last decades of the Han are a slow-motion disaster. A general seized the capital, deposed one boy emperor, and installed another. And when the coalition of warlords assembled against him, he burned Luoyang to the ground and forced the entire population, hundreds of thousands, to march west with him, and the roadside was lined with the dead. He was assassinated. His officers fought over the corpse of the government. The boy emperor spent years being dragged from camp to camp, at one point living in ruins and eating with his officials from a broken pot. He ended in the hands of a man named Cao Cao, who was the ablest of the warlords and the most interesting. Cao Cao was a poet as well as a soldier, and his poems are among the finest of the period, plain and heavy and sad, about the bones of soldiers lying white in the fields, and not a cock crowing for 1,000 miles. He was also ruthless enough that Chinese opera has painted his face white for 1,000 years, which is the color of treachery. Asked as a young man what he would become, a famous judge of character is said to have told him that he would be an able minister in a time of peace and a treacherous villain in a time of chaos, and Cao Cao laughed with pleasure. He never took the throne. He said that if heaven's mandate rested on him, he would be like King Wen, who prepared the way and left the crown to his son. His son took it in 220, and the Han was over. What followed was 360 years of division. It is the longest break in the imperial story, and if you know only one thing about it, you probably know it as a novel. 3 kingdoms formed. Wei in the north, the largest and richest, founded by Cao Cao's son. Wu in the southeast, along the Yangtze, defended by rivers and ships. And Shuhan in the west, in the mountain basin of Sichuan. The smallest, founded by Liu Bei, a distant and impoverished relative of the Han house, who had once sold straw sandals and mats for a living. The romance of the 3 kingdoms was written more than 1,000 years later, and it is fiction, and it is probably the most beloved book in Chinese history. It gave the culture its permanent images of loyalty and strategy. The oath sworn in the Peach Garden by Liu Bei and his 2 sworn brothers, the terrifying Zhang Fei and the red-faced Guan Yu, with his long beard and his green robe. Guan Yu would be deified, and there are temples to him today, from Taipei to San Francisco, worshipped by soldiers, police, and organized criminals alike, all of whom value loyalty. And above all, it gave China Zhuge Liang, the strategist in the feather fan, whom Liu Bei visited 3 times at his thatched cottage before he agreed to serve. Zhuge Liang is the archetype of intelligence itself in Chinese culture. He is said to have obtained 100,000 arrows for a coming battle by sending straw-stuffed boats out into the river fog and having them shot at. He is said, when a vastly superior army approached a city he had left almost empty, to have opened the gates, had the streets swept, and sat on the wall playing the zither, until the enemy commander, convinced it was a trap, withdrew. The historical Zhuge Liang was chancellor of the weakest of the 3 states, and led 5 hopeless northern campaigns trying to restore the Han, knowing the odds. Before the last of them, he wrote a memorial to his young and useless sovereign, that is still memorized in Chinese schools, and it ends by saying that he will give his utmost until his heart stops beating. He died in camp. His last recorded concern was the disposal of his troops for a safe retreat. The great battle of the age was at Red Cliffs in the winter of 208, when Cao Cao brought an enormous army and fleet down the Yangtze to finish the south, and the allied southern forces, hugely outnumbered, exploited the fact that his northern soldiers were seasick and had chained the ships together for stability. They sent in fire ships on a wind that a southern commander had predicted, and the chained fleet burned, and Cao Cao retreated overland through mud, and China stayed divided. The 3 kingdoms were reunited briefly by the Jin dynasty in 280, and the reunion lasted about a generation before it fell apart in a civil war between imperial princes so destructive that it left the north defenseless. Then the peoples of the frontier came in. They had been coming in for a long time already, settled inside the border as auxiliaries and tenants, Xiongnu remnants, Xianbei, Di, Qiang, Jie. In 311 they took Luoyang and burned it, and killed 30,000 people. In 316 they took Chang'an. The Jin court fled south across the Yangtze and re-established itself at Nanjing, and for the next 270 years there were 2 Chinas. The north became the 16 kingdoms, a churn of short-lived states founded by non-Chinese rulers, some of them appalling, some of them remarkable. One ruler of the later Zhao was a former slave who became a tyrant of such violence that his reign reads like a horror story. Another, Fu Jian of the former Qin, nearly reunified everything and marched south in 383 with an army so large that he boasted his men could dam the Yangtze by throwing their whips into it, and was destroyed at the River Fei by a force a fraction of the size, partly because his conscripted troops from a dozen subject peoples had no interest in fighting for him, and partly because a rumor of defeat ran through the column and could not be stopped. Eventually the north was unified by the Northern Wei, founded by the Tuoba clan of the Xianbei, and what they did is the interesting part. In 494, their Emperor Xiaowen moved the capital south to Luoyang, adopted Chinese dress, banned the Xianbei language at court, changed the imperial surname from Tuoba to the Chinese Yuan, and encouraged intermarriage with the great Chinese families. His own kin found this humiliating, and there were revolts. But the pattern was set, and it would repeat for the next 1,500 years. Conquerors of China are absorbed by China. Not always, not completely, and never without leaving traces of their own, but the direction of the current is remarkably consistent. The South, meanwhile, filled up. The great families who fled the North brought their libraries, their servants, and their pretensions, and they settled in the warm, wet country along the Yangtze and began to develop it. Rice paddies spread. The forests were cleared. Nanjing became a city of scholars and monks and poets, and for the first time in Chinese history, the South began to matter economically. That shift, from the millet growing north to the rice growing south, would take another 500 years to complete, and when it was complete, it changed everything. Because rice supports far more people per acre than millet or wheat. The southern courts were elegant, unstable, and largely powerless. 6 dynasties came and went at Nanjing in less than 3 centuries. The aristocracy cultivated a style of refined uselessness, holding conversations about metaphysics known as pure talk, competing in calligraphy and wine and wit, and looking down on anyone who was actually good at administration. And out of that came some of the loveliest things China ever produced. Wang Shiji, in 353, held a party at the Orchid Pavilion, where the guests sat along a winding stream and floated cups of wine down it, and whoever the cup stopped in front of had to compose a poem or drink a forfeit. Afterwards, he wrote a preface to the collected poems, slightly drunk, in running script, and it became the single most admired piece of calligraphy in Chinese history. He tried to write it out again later, many times, and could never match it. The original was so treasured that a Tang emperor is said to have had it buried with him. And there was Tao Yuanming, who quit his post as a magistrate after 80 days because he refused, in his own phrase, to bend his waist for 5 pecks of rice, went home to a small farm, and wrote poems about beans and chrysanthemums, and drinking that are still, 16 centuries later, exactly what people read when they want to feel the appeal of a quiet life. He plucked chrysanthemums by the eastern hedge, he wrote, and gazed far off at the southern hills. And in this there is a true meaning. But when he tried to explain it, he had already forgotten the words. The most important development of these divided centuries, though, was not literary. It was Buddhism. It had trickled in along the trade roads during the Han, and had been treated at first as a variety of Taoism, a foreign school of immortality practice. Then, in the wreckage of the 3rd and 4th centuries, it took hold, and it took hold in both halves of the country at once, north and south, Chinese and non-Chinese alike. It is not hard to see why. Confucianism has almost nothing to say to a person whose family has been killed and whose village has been burned. It is a philosophy of a functioning society, and the society had stopped functioning. Buddhism came with an explanation for suffering, a mechanism of cause and effect running across many lives, a promise that merit could be accumulated and transferred to dead relatives, an enormous caste of compassionate beings who could be appealed to, and an institution, the monastery, which offered food, shelter, literacy, and a way out of conscription and taxation. It also came with translation problems of extraordinary difficulty, since Sanskrit and Chinese are as unlike as two languages can be. The greatest of the translators was Kumarajiva, a monk from Kucha in the Tarim Basin, who was kidnapped by a Chinese general who wanted his prestige, held for 17 years, forced to break his vows, and finally brought to Chong in 401, where he was given a state translation bureau with hundreds of assistants. His versions of the Lotus Sutra and the Diamond Sutra are so fluent that they are still the standard ones today, more than 16 centuries later, in preference to more literally accurate translations made afterwards. And it came with art. The cave temples are the physical evidence, and they are staggering. At Dunhuang, at the desert edge where the trade roads split, monks cut hundreds of chapels into a cliff face over 1,000 years, and covered every surface with painting, and one of them, at some point around the 11th century, was sealed up with 50,000 manuscripts inside and forgotten, and opened again in 1900. At Yungang, the Northern Wei carved 51,000 statues into sandstone, including seated Buddhas 60 feet high, the earliest of them said to be modeled on the emperors themselves. At Longmen, near Luoyang, the carving went on for centuries. Watch the faces change if you go. The earliest ones are Indian and Central Asian, heavy-lidded, with clinging robes. Within a century or two, they have thinned into the elongated, gently smiling, robed figures of Chinese aristocratic taste, and then filled out again into the round, calm, physically present bodies of the Tang. The religion arrived as a foreign import and became over 400 years entirely Chinese, growing its own schools that exist nowhere else, including the meditation school called Chan, which traveled on to Japan and is known in the West by its Japanese name, Zen. There was resistance. Confucians objected that monks did not marry, which was a failure of filial duty, that they did not kneel to the emperor, that they left the productive economy, and that the monasteries were accumulating enormous tax-free wealth and land. There were 4 major state persecutions across the centuries, and the largest, in 845, closed more than 4,000 monasteries and returned 250,000 monks and nuns to lay life, largely for fiscal reasons. Buddhism survived all of them, but after 845 it never again dominated the state. Reunification, when it came from the north, from the militarized, half-nomadic aristocracy of the northwest, and it came suddenly. A general named Yang Jian, whose family had married into the Xianbei elite, seized the throne of one of the northern successor states in 581, spent 8 years preparing, and then sent his fleet down the Yangtze and swallowed the south in a matter of months. He called his dynasty Sui. He was frugal, suspicious, hard-working, and effective. He rebuilt the census, reissued the law code in a much shortened and less savage form, restored the granary system, and re-established a single currency. His son, Emperor Yang, is one of the great villains of the traditional histories, and like most such figures, the portrait is at least half propaganda produced by the dynasty that replaced him. But even discounting it, he attempted an amount of work in a short time that no population could bear. He rebuilt Luoyang as a second capital, using, according to one account, 2 million laborers. He extended the Great Wall, and the figure given for one stretch is over 1 million workers, of whom half died. He sent enormous expeditions to Korea, 3 of them, and all 3 failed. the first with an army whose reported size is well over 1 million men, of whom a few thousand returned. He built a fleet of dragon boats and toured his empire in state. And he built the Grand Canal. That one was worth it. The problem it solved is geographical and permanent. China's great rivers run west to east, which means that moving goods north to south is far harder than moving them east to west. And the food was increasingly grown in the south while the armies and the capital were in the north. The canal linked the Yangtze to the Yellow River and eventually ran over 1,000 miles, from Hangzhou in the south up to the region of modern Beijing. It was cut by conscripted labor on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. Men and women both, with a reported 5.5 million workers on one section, and the mortality was enormous. And the canal is still in use today. Emperor Yang was killed by his own guards in 618, strangled with a silk scarf at his own request, having asked only that he not be made to look at a blade. He had reigned 14 years. His empire had been wrecked by his own ambitions, and rebellion was universal. The man who came out on top was one of his relatives by marriage, a frontier general named Li Yuan. And the dynasty he founded is the one that Chinese people, when they think of the height of their civilization, tend to think of first. The Tang lasted from 618 to 907, and its capital, Chang'an, rebuilt on the Sui foundations, was the largest and most cosmopolitan city on earth. The scale is hard to take in. It was a rectangle about 6 miles by 5, laid out on a strict grid, surrounded by walls of rammed earth 30 feet thick at the base. Inside were 108 walled wards, each with its own gates that were closed at nightfall by drumbeat, after which being on the main avenues without a permit was a punishable offense. The central avenue running from the southern gate to the palace was 150 meters wide. The population within the walls was around 1 million, with perhaps another 1 million in the surrounding area, and it was full of foreigners. There were Sogdian merchants from Central Asia running the caravan trade and the wine shops, where the waitresses were famously blue-eyed and the poets wrote about them. There were Persians, including, after the Arab conquest of Persia, refugee members of the Sassanid royal family and a Persian community that maintained fire temples. There were Turks, Uyghurs, Tibetans, Koreans, Japanese, Indians, Arabs. There were Nestorian Christians who arrived in 635, were granted permission to preach, and left a stone stele in 781 recording the whole thing in Chinese and Syriac, which was dug up 800 years later and astonished the Jesuits. There were Manichaeans and Zoroastrians and Jews. The Japanese sent official embassies for 2 centuries, and the young monks and officials who came on them went home and rebuilt their own capital, Nara, as a copy of Chang'an on a smaller scale, and imported the writing, the bureaucratic structure, the Buddhism, the poetry, and the tea. Korea did the same. The Tang is when East Asia became a cultural region rather than a set of neighbors. Everything was in fashion. Central Asian music played on the pipa. Polo imported from Persia, played by aristocratic women as well as men. Foreign clothes, foreign hairstyles. The ceramic figurines from Tang tombs, glazed in that unmistakable 3-color splash of amber and green and cream, show you the population of the city better than any text does. There are camels with their heads thrown back, braying, loaded with silk and with a monkey riding on the pack. There are grooms with big noses and beards and pointed caps. There are horses, endless horses, because the Tang aristocracy were horse people who had come out of the northwestern frontier and never lost the taste. And there are court ladies who are noticeably plump because in the 8th century that was the fashion, with their hair piled high and their faces made up with rouge and forehead ornaments. The second Tang emperor is the one who set the tone, and he came to the throne by murdering his brothers. Li Shimin was the second son, and he had done most of the fighting that won the empire for his father. In 626, expecting to be killed first, he ambushed his elder brother, the crown prince, and his younger brother at the Xuanwu gate of the palace, and shot them dead himself, then had their 10 sons executed, then sent an officer to inform his father, who abdicated within 3 months. It was as naked a seizure as Chinese history contains, and then he governed so well that the histories forgave him. As Emperor Taizong, he cut taxes, reduced the number of officials, revised the law code so that death sentences had to be reviewed multiple times before execution, and, most unusually, cultivated criticism. He kept as his chief remonstrating official a man named Wei Zheng, who had served the murdered crown prince and had openly advised him to kill Li Shimin first. Taizong asked him why he had done it, and Wei Zheng said that if the prince had listened to him, he would not be dead. Taizong made him a minister. For 17 years, Wei Zheng told the emperor what he was doing wrong, hundreds of times in public, and Taizong, who by his own admission sometimes went back to his private chambers and swore that he would kill that peasant one day, kept listening. When Wei Zheng died, the emperor said that with a mirror of bronze one may straighten one's cap, with the mirror of history one may understand the rise and fall of states, and with the mirror of a man one may see one's own faults, and that he had now lost one of his mirrors. The system Taizong ran was the mature form of the imperial state, and it is worth understanding because it lasted, in essence, for the next 13 centuries. There were 3 departments at the top. One drafted policy, one reviewed it and could reject it, and one executed it through 6 ministries covering personnel, revenue, rights, war, justice, and public works. Alongside them was a censorate, whose job was to investigate and impeach officials at every level, including, in principle, the emperor. The empire was divided into prefectures and counties, and officials were forbidden to serve in their home region, and were rotated every 3 or 4 years, so that they could not build a local power base, and they were selected, increasingly, by examination. The examination system had existed in embryo since the Han, but the Tang made it a real route to power, and the Song would make it the main one. Candidates studied the Confucian classics and were tested on memorization, on the interpretation of passages, on the composition of poetry in strict regulated forms, and on policy essays about practical problems of government. The examinations were held in the capital. They took days. The candidates were sealed into individual cells with a bucket, and the pass rate in the hardest degree was on the order of 1 or 2%. It was not democracy, and it was not entirely fair. Preparing a son for the examinations took a decade or more of full-time study and a tutor, which only a certain level of family could afford. But it was not hereditary, and that is the point. In no other pre-modern state on Earth was the ruling class selected by written examination in literature and moral philosophy. It made China's elite a class of scholars rather than a class of warriors, and that single fact explains an enormous amount about the shape of Chinese history, for good and for ill. Taizong's son was weak, and his son's favorite was the most extraordinary woman in Chinese history. Wu Zhao had entered the palace at 13 as a junior concubine of Taizong. When he died, all the childless concubines were sent to a Buddhist convent to have their heads shaved and spend the rest of their lives in prayer. She was retrieved from it by the new emperor, Taizong's son, who had noticed her while his father was dying. She came back into the palace, produced sons, and destroyed her rivals with a thoroughness that the histories describe in terms so lurid that some of it must be invention. The empress and the senior consort were accused of witchcraft, deposed, imprisoned, and, in one account, had their hands and feet cut off and were thrown into a wine vat. She became empress in 655. Her husband suffered from crippling headaches and failing eyesight, possibly a series of strokes, and she began to handle documents for him, and then to sit behind a screen at audiences, and then to rule. When he died in 683, she deposed one son after 6 weeks, installed another, and in 690 stopped pretending. She declared a new dynasty, the Zhou, named after the ancient one, and took the throne as emperor in her own right, the only woman ever to do so in China. She was in her 60s. She ruled for 15 years. She used terror. She set up copper boxes in the palace to receive anonymous denunciations, and employed a group of secret police officials whose interrogation manual, cheerfully titled The Classic of Entrapment, survives in summary. Great aristocratic families of the old northwestern establishment were destroyed by the hundred, but she also expanded the examination system dramatically, precisely because she needed officials who owed everything to her and nothing to their ancestors. And she promoted men of talent from nowhere. And by common consent, the administration during her reign was efficient, the frontiers held, and the population grew. She promoted Buddhism hard, since Confucian doctrine gave her no legitimacy whatsoever, and had a text circulated prophesying a female universal monarch. She commissioned colossal Buddhist sculpture, and the great seated Vairocana Buddha at Longmen, 55 feet high, serene, with a faint smile and heavy-lidded eyes, is traditionally said to have been given her face. She was pushed out in 705, at the age of 80, by a palace coup and died the same year. Her tomb, shared with her husband, has never been opened. In front of it stands a stone tablet, 20 feet high, prepared for her epitaph, and it is completely blank. Nobody knows whether that was her instruction or her successor's refusal. After a brief and murderous period, in which her daughter-in-law tried to repeat the trick and failed, the throne came to her grandson, and under him the Tang reached its peak and then fell off a cliff. Emperor Xuanzong reigned for 44 years. The first 30 were the Golden Age. The capital was rich, the granaries full, the frontiers extended, the court crowded with the most talented people alive. This is the age of Chinese poetry, and it is impossible to overstate what that means. A collection made in the 18th century gathers around 48,900 Tang poems by more than 2,200 authors. Poetry was not a specialist activity. It was a social skill, a required part of the examination, a normal thing to do at a farewell dinner, or on a boat, or when you could not sleep, and the greatest poets in the language were writing at the same time and knew each other. Li Bai was a wanderer, a Taoist, a drinker, and probably not entirely Chinese by birth, having come from somewhere out in Central Asia. He was summoned to court, wrote poems for the emperor, offended everyone, and left after 2 years. He writes about the moon, about wine, about mountains, about parting from friends, with a lightness that survives translation better than almost anything. He asks the moon to drink with him, and his shadow makes 3. He describes the sound of a flute drifting through a spring night in Luoyang, and asks who in such a night would not feel homesick. He was said to have drowned trying to embrace the moon's reflection in a river, which is not true, and is exactly the death everyone wanted for him. Du Fu was the opposite, poor, ill, unlucky in office, and morally serious to his bones. He is the poet of the catastrophe that was coming, and his verses about the war are among the most unbearable ever written about war anywhere. He describes an old man conscripted at 60, and the recruiting officer coming to a village at night where the only people left are an old woman and her daughter-in-law with no whole skirt to wear. and the old woman offering to go herself to the front to cook, because she is what is left. He also wrote, in the middle of it all, one of the most quietly devastating lines in the language, that behind the vermilion gates wine and meat go bad, while on the road outside lie the bones of the frozen dead. Wang Wei painted and wrote and became a Buddhist, and his short poems about empty mountains are so still that they barely seem to have an author. Empty hills, he writes, no one in sight, only the sound of someone talking, and light returning into the deep wood, shining again on the green moss. What went wrong is a familiar story with an unfamiliar amount of romance attached. The emperor in his 50s fell in love with his son's wife. Her name was Yang Yuhuan, known as Yang Guifei, and she was, in the traditional account, one of the 4 great beauties of Chinese history, plump in the fashion of the day, a talented dancer and musician. He took her from his son by having her briefly ordained as a Taoist nun and then bringing her back. He then lost interest in governing. Her cousin became chief minister. Her sisters were showered with wealth. Lychees were carried by relay riders from the far south to the capital, a distance of well over 1,000 miles, so that she could have them fresh. At the same time, the military system had changed. The old militia system had broken down and been replaced by permanent professional armies on the frontiers under long-serving commanders, many of them of non-Chinese origin, with enormous forces under their personal control. The most powerful of these was a Sogdian and Turkic general named Anlushan, hugely fat, a favorite at court, whom Yang Guifei had adopted as a son in a court joke that included wrapping him in swaddling clothes. He commanded 3 frontier regions and perhaps 160,000 troops. In the winter of 755, he revolted. The revolt took Luoyang within a month and Chang'an within a year. The court fled west towards Sichuan. At a place called Maui, 40 miles out, the imperial guard mutinied. They killed the chief minister, and then they refused to move until the emperor gave them Yang Guifei as well, on the grounds that while her cousin's kin lived, nobody was safe. The emperor could not save her. She was taken into a small Buddhist shrine by a courtyard and strangled with a silk cord and buried by the roadside, and the army moved on. 50 years later, the poet Bai Ji Juyi wrote a long ballad about it, the Song of Everlasting Sorrow, and it made the story permanent. He describes the emperor covering his face because he cannot save her, and afterwards returning to a capital full of ghosts, seeing her face in the hibiscus of the palace lake, and her eyebrows in the willow leaves, and lying awake through nights of pattering rain, and finally sending a Taoist wizard to search the heavens for her soul, and finding her on a fairy mountain, and receiving back a broken hairpin and a promise that in heaven they would be birds that share a wing, and on earth branches of a tree that grow together. The rebellion took 8 years to put down, and it required Uyghur mercenaries to do it, who were paid by being allowed to sack Luoyang. The census figures before and after the war show a fall from around 53 million registered people to around 17 million. That does not mean 36 million died. It means the registration system collapsed. But the true mortality, from fighting, famine, and the epidemics that follow both, was catastrophic on any reading, and by some estimates, it was among the deadliest events in human history to that point. The Tang lasted another century and a half, but it was a different thing afterwards. The frontier commands never fully returned to central control. The tax system was rebuilt on a new basis, the twice-a-year tax, assessed on property rather than on heads, which quietly conceded that the old system of state allocated equal fields was dead. Eunuchs took control of the palace armies and, by the 9th century, were making and unmaking emperors. Buddhism was persecuted for its wealth in 845. A salt smuggler named Huang Chao raised a rebellion in 874 that wandered across the whole country for a decade, sacked Guangzhou, where an Arab account claims that over 100,000 foreign merchants were killed, and took both capitals. Chang'an, the greatest city in the world, was fought over, looted, and burned repeatedly. It never recovered. It is a provincial capital today, and the walls you can walk on there are Ming. In 907, a former lieutenant of Huang Chao, who had changed sides, deposed the last Tang emperor and killed him, along with most of the imperial clan. He is said to have had 30 or so senior officials of the old regime thrown into the Yellow River, remarking that these men who called themselves the pure stream could now become muddy. There followed 53 years called the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms, 5 short military regimes in the north, and a scatter of regional states in the south, an age of coups and murdered rulers. It was also, unexpectedly, when printing came into its own. The first complete printed book we can date is a copy of the Diamond Sutra from Dunhuang, made in 868, 7 sheets of paper pasted into a scroll with a woodcut frontispiece, and a colophon saying it was made for free distribution by a man on behalf of his parents. And between 932 and 953, the entire Confucian canon was cut into printing blocks and published by the state, which meant that for the first time the fundamental texts of the civilization could be owned rather than borrowed and copied. Then, in 960, the commander of the palace guard was on campaign when his officers came into its tent at dawn and put a yellow robe on him and hailed him as emperor. He affected reluctance. He had almost certainly arranged it. His name was Zhao Kuangyin, and the dynasty he founded is called Song, and it is the one the specialists love. He had watched 5 dynasties fall in his own lifetime, all of them destroyed by their own generals, and he was determined that it would not happen to his. His solution was famous for its mildness. He invited his senior commanders to a banquet, got them comfortable, and then said with apparent melancholy that he had not slept well since taking the throne, because who could say that one day their own subordinates might not put a yellow robe on one of them, whether they wished it or not? They asked what they should do. He suggested that life is short, that they should take generous pensions and estates, and fine houses, and enjoy their families, and that he would marry into their households, so that there would be no suspicion between them. They resigned the next morning. He is said to have taken away their military authority over a cup of wine. Then he subordinated the entire army to civil officials. Generals were rotated so that they never commanded the same troops for long. The civil service was expanded, and the examinations were made the dominant route into it, with the number of degrees awarded rising many times over, and the examinations themselves reformed to make cheating harder, with candidates' names covered and their papers recopied by clerks so that the handwriting could not be recognized. The result was the most civilian government China ever had, and it worked spectacularly well in every respect except the one that eventually mattered. The Song economy is the thing that makes historians reach for superlatives. Iron production in the 11th century has been estimated at over 100,000 tons a year, comparable to the whole of Europe 600 years later. Coal was mined and used for smelting on a large scale in the north. The rice varieties from Champa, in what is now Vietnam, ripened early enough to allow 2 crops a year in the south, and the population doubled, passing 100 million for the first time. The cities were unlike anything before them. Kaifeng, the northern capital, had abandoned the old walled ward system entirely. Shops opened onto the streets. There was no curfew. There were night markets that ran until dawn, restaurants specializing in the cuisines of particular regions, theaters, tea houses, and an entertainment district with acrobats, storytellers, puppeteers, and wrestlers. A 12th century memoir of the city lists the food sold in the streets, and it runs for pages, and it includes iced drinks in summer. We can see it. A painter named Zhang Zedwan produced a hand scroll 17 feet long, showing the city and its river on a spring festival day, and it survives. You unroll it from the right, starting in the quiet countryside with a train of donkeys, and move gradually into the traffic, and there are boats being poled, and a crowd on a great arched wooden bridge shouting at a barge whose mast is about to hit it, and camels going out through the gate, and a man having his fortune told, and a child being carried, and a restaurant with an awning, and around 800 people in all, every one of them doing something specific. They had paper money, first as private merchant receipts, and then issued by the state from the 11th century, the first government paper currency anywhere. They had a huge maritime trade, with compass-equipped ships running to Southeast Asia and India, and a customs office in Guangzhou and Quanzhou taking a share of it. They had movable type, invented by a commoner named Bi Sheng around 1040, using fired clay characters, though for Chinese, with its thousands of characters, whole-page woodblocks usually remained more practical. They had gunpowder, which had been discovered by Taoist alchemists looking for elixirs of immortality, and by the Song it was being used in fire lances, in bombs thrown by catapults, and in rockets. And they had a scientific curiosity that had no real parallel at the time. Shen Kuo, a Song official who was also a mathematician, astronomer, geologist, and civil engineer, wrote a book of essays in retirement that includes the first clear description of the magnetic compass and, remarkably, the observation that its needle points slightly east of true north. He looked at a stratum of seashells and rounded stones exposed in a cliff hundreds of miles inland and correctly concluded that this had once been the shore. He looked at fossilized bamboo found in a dry northern region where bamboo does not grow, and concluded that the climate must have changed. The intellectual life had a similar restlessness. Confucianism was rebuilt from the ground up in what we call Neo-Confucianism, absorbing metaphysical questions from Buddhism and Taoism that the classical tradition had never addressed, and producing in Zhu Xi a synthesizer whose commentaries would become the required orthodox reading for the imperial examinations from the 14th century until 1905. It was also the age in which Chinese painting became what people mean when they use the phrase. Landscape had been a background before. Under the Song it became the subject, and the way it was handled has no parallel anywhere else. A monumental Song landscape does not have a horizon and a vanishing point. It is built in 3 distances, and the eye is meant to travel through it rather than stand outside it looking in. You enter at the bottom where the brushwork is detailed, and there are usually small human things: a bridge, a mule train, a temple roof, a fisherman, a man with a bundle. Then a band of mist. Then the middle ground, less distinct. Then more mist. Then the mountain, enormous, taking up most of the height of the silk, its texture built up in short, repeated strokes that the critics named after the things they resemble: raindrop, hemp fiber, axe cut. The figures are always tiny. That is the point. One of the great surviving works, a hanging scroll of travelers among streams and mountains, is over 6 feet high, and the men and donkeys in the lower corner are less than an inch. The painter signed it only in the shadow of the leaves, where nobody noticed for 900 years. The theory behind it was written down. A painter should not simply reproduce what a mountain looks like from one place, because a mountain looks different from every angle and in every season, and even in every hour, and the point is to convey what it is to be among mountains. One 11th century essayist wrote that a landscape should be one you can travel in, gaze at, wander in, and live in, and that the last two are the highest. He also observed, practically, that painters of the age were producing work for scholars who were stuck in offices in the capital and who wanted, without leaving their desks, to hear the cry of a gibbon and the call of a bird. Later, under the southern song at Hangzhou, the whole thing contracted. The mountains slid to one corner. Vast empty spaces of unpainted silk opened up, standing for mist and water and sky, and a single branch or a single figure in a boat carried the entire weight of the picture. The style is called one-corner painting, and its emptiness is not laziness. It is a claim about where the meaning lives. And running alongside it was a quieter idea that would take over Chinese art entirely. Professional painters at court were craftsmen, however brilliant, but a scholar who painted in ink alone, without color, without commission, without trying to make the thing look like anything in particular, was doing something else. He was expressing his own character with the same brush he used to write with, and the value of the picture lay in the quality of the man. This is literati painting, and it produced, over the next 800 years, thousands of ink bamboo groves and windswept pines and rocks that seem to have been painted in about 4 minutes by someone slightly drunk, and it is one of the hardest bodies of art in the world for an outsider to learn to see. Porcelain went the same way. Song imperial wares are not decorated. They are single glazes, pale blue-green, or a lavender gray that shifts color with the light, or an ivory white on shapes copied from ancient bronze, and the finest of them are deliberately crackled, the glaze crazed into a net of fine lines by cooling faster than the body beneath. Fewer than 100 pieces of one of these wares are believed to survive anywhere in the world. Later dynasties would paint porcelain gloriously, and the world would go mad for the blue and white, and song collectors, if they had lived to see it, would probably have found it vulgar. There were also enormous political fights. In the 11th century, a reformer named Wang Anshi pushed through a program of state loans to farmers at harvest time, state marketing boards, a land survey to make taxation fair, and a replacement of forced labor service with a hired system paid for by a graduated tax. He was opposed with real ferocity by conservatives, including the historian Sima Guang, on the grounds that the state was meddling and the local officials would abuse the loans, which they did. The factions ruined each other for decades, exiling one another whenever they got the upper hand, and the great weakness sat all the time on the northern frontier. The Song never controlled the northern grasslands or the passes, and so never had good horses, and so never had cavalry that could match its enemies. To the north was the Liao Empire of the Khitan people, a nomadic dynasty that had taken 16 prefectures inside the wall line. The Song fought them, failed, and in 1005 signed a treaty agreeing to send an annual payment of silver and silk. It was expensive and humiliating, and it was also cheaper than war, and it bought a century of peace. To the northwest was the Xixia state of the Tangut people, who invented their own script, an enormously complicated one, deliberately unlike Chinese, and who also had to be paid. Then, in the early 12th century, a new people called the Jurchen rose in Manchuria and destroyed the Liao. The Song, seeing an opportunity, allied with them against their old enemy, and watched their new allies notice how poorly the Song army performed. In 1127, the Jurchen came south and took Kaifeng, and carried off the retired emperor, the reigning emperor, and some 3,000 members of the court and imperial family into captivity in the far north, where the two emperors died. It is called the Jingkang humiliation. and it is still a byword. A surviving prince re-established the dynasty south of the Yangtze with its capital at Hangzhou, and that is called the Southern Song, and it lasted another 150 years, and it was even richer than before, because the maritime trade of the southern coast was now the center of everything. It also produced the most famous patriot in Chinese history. Yue Fei was a general who won victories against the Jurchen and wanted to march north and recover the lost territory and bring the captive emperors home, which would have been extremely awkward for the reigning emperor, who was their relative, and owed his throne to their absence. He was recalled by 12 urgent orders in a single day, arrested and executed in prison in 1142, on a charge that his accuser reportedly justified with the phrase that it was perhaps not groundless. His tomb at Hangzhou has iron statues of his accusers kneeling in front of it, and for centuries visitors spat on them. It is worth pausing again here in the middle of the song and looking at how people actually lived, because by this point the texture of ordinary Chinese life had taken the shape it would keep, more or less, until the 20th century. Start with tea. It had been drunk in the southwest for a very long time, as a medicine, and then as a bitter soup with salt and ginger, and sometimes onion boiled into it. By the Tang it had become a drink, and a monk-turned-writer named Lu Yu produced a book about it, the classic of tea, covering the plant, the tools, the making, the water, and the correct conduct of drinking, which is arguably the first monograph on a beverage written anywhere. By the song it had become an obsession. The fashion was for powdered tea, whisked in the bowl with hot water into a froth, and there were competitions to see whose froth stood longest and whitest, judged by the mark it left on the rim. Dark glazed bowls from the Jian kilns were prized because they showed the white foam best, and the finest of them have glazes that broke in the kiln into patterns like partridge feathers or oil spots or hare's fur, which nobody could control, and everybody wanted. When Japanese monks came to study, they took the powdered tea and the whisk home with them, and that is why the Japanese tea ceremony uses a method the Chinese themselves abandoned a few centuries later in favor of steeping loose leaves. Then the food. The song is when Chinese cooking becomes recognizably itself. The iron wok, thin enough to heat instantly over a fierce fire, made stir-frying possible, and stir-frying is an economy of fuel as much as a technique, since a chopped dish cooks in 2 minutes, where a stew burns wood all afternoon. Restaurants specialized. Wheat noodles in the north, rice in the south, soy sauce and fermented bean pastes, ice houses in the cities supplying cold drinks. A 12th century writer complains, in the way that people always complain, that the food in the capital is not what it was. Then the family, which is the real unit of everything. The ideal was several generations under one roof, the eldest male in authority, the daughters marrying out into other households, and the sons bringing wives in. A bride left her own family and joined her husband's ancestral line, and her position in the new household was precarious, until she produced a son, after which it improved, and improved again when her son married, and she acquired a daughter-in-law of her own to supervise. The mother-in-law and the daughter-in-law are the great tense relationship of Chinese domestic literature, and they are tense for structural reasons, not personal ones. Ancestor worship was the frame around all of it. Every household of any means kept tablets for the dead and offered food and incense at the proper seasons and swept the graves in spring at the Qingming festival. The dead needed descendants the way the living need food. To have no son was not merely sad, it was a metaphysical failure, and it was the standard justification for concubinage and adoption alike. Mencius had said long before that of the 3 ways of being unfilial, having no heir is the worst, and it is in the song, or just before it. That one of the more disturbing practices in Chinese social history begins. Foot binding seems to have started among dancers and court entertainers in the 10th century, and spread upward and then outward over the following centuries until, by the late imperial period, it was near universal among Han Chinese women outside the poorest laboring families. The bones of the arch and the toes of a girl of 5 or 6 were broken and bound, over years, into a shape a few inches long. It made walking difficult and running impossible. It was maintained overwhelmingly by women, mothers binding daughters, because an unbound girl could not marry well, and marriage was the only career available. The Manchus banned it for their own women and never succeeded in stopping it among the Chinese. It ended, finally, in the 20th century, and there were women alive with bound feet within living memory. Medicine, meanwhile, had become an enormous organized body of knowledge. Its framework was not anatomy but process. Health was the free and balanced circulation of qi through channels, and illness was blockage, excess or depletion, and treatment aimed at restoring flow through needles, moxibustion, and above all, drugs. The pharmacopoeias are staggering compilations. The greatest of them, the Compendium of Materia Medica, assembled by Li Shizhen in the 16th century over 27 years, describes nearly 1,900 substances with more than 11,000 prescriptions, and includes his own corrections of errors he found in earlier books by going out and looking at the plants. Some of it is superstition, some of it is not. The compound that won a Nobel Prize in Medicine in 2015 for the treatment of malaria was found by a Chinese researcher who read a 4th century handbook of emergency prescriptions and noticed that it said to soak sweet wormwood in cold water and wring it out, and realized that this meant the active ingredient was destroyed by heat. The calendar gave the year its shape. New Year at the second new moon after the winter solstice, with debts settled, houses cleaned, doors pasted with red paper, and firecrackers to drive off the beast. Qingming in spring for the graves, the Dragon Boat Festival in the 5th month, with races and rice dumplings, commemorating a loyal minister of ancient Chu, who drowned himself in despair at his king's folly, and whose body the local people raced out to save, and then fed the fish so they would leave him alone. The 7th night of the 7th month, for the weaver girl and the cowherd, 2 lovers who are stars, allowed to meet once a year across the river of heaven on a bridge made of magpies. The moon festival in autumn, with round cakes, and the hare that lives on the moon pounding the elixir of immortality in a mortar. And in the villages, underneath and around the great organized traditions, there was the ordinary religion of most people, which was not Confucian or Buddhist or Taoist, but all 3 at once and older than any of them. There were gods of the soil, and of walls and moats, and of the kitchen stove, and the kitchen god watched the household all year and went up to heaven at New Year to report, which is why his paper image was smeared with honey before he was burned, so that his mouth would be sticky and his words sweet. There were dragon kings in the rivers who had to be petitioned for rain and could be punished by having their statues left out in the sun if they failed to send it. There were ghosts, hungry ones, released for a month in the 7th moon and fed on the streets so that they would go away again. None of this was much affected by which dynasty happened to be sitting in the capital. Emperors came and went. The stove gods still had to be sweetened. Meanwhile, out on the steppe, something else had happened. In 1206, a confederation of Mongol tribes acclaimed a man named Temujin as their universal ruler, Chinggis Khan. And within a generation, the Mongols had assembled the most effective military machine in the world, mounted, disciplined, capable of moving at speeds nobody could match, and absolutely willing to slaughter entire cities as a demonstration to the next one. They destroyed the Xixia. They destroyed the Jurchenjin. And then they came for the Song, and the Song, astonishingly, held them off for 45 years, longer than any other state the Mongols attacked, anywhere from Korea to Hungary. Because southern China is a country of rivers and paddy fields and walled cities where cavalry cannot maneuver. The siege of the twin cities of Xiangyang alone took 5 years and was only broken when the Mongols brought in 2 Muslim engineers from Persia to build counterweight trebuchets of a Western design capable of throwing stones of over 100 kilograms. The end came in 1279 at a naval battle at Yaishan in the far south. The last Song fleet was chained together and defeated, and a senior official took the last emperor, a boy of 7, on his back and jumped into the sea. Tens of thousands are said to have followed. For the first time, the whole of China was ruled by a foreign dynasty. The Mongols called it the Yuan, and its emperor was Kublai Khan, grandson of Chinggis. Kublai was, by Mongol standards, a Sinophile. He built a capital in the north on the site of modern Beijing called Dadu, laid out on a grid with a walled palace city inside it. And he ran a court that used Chinese ritual alongside Mongol custom. He extended the Grand Canal to reach it. He patronized drama. And the Yuan is the great age of Chinese theater, partly because so many educated men were shut out of government and had to find something else to do. Because the Mongols did not trust the Chinese scholar class, they suspended the examinations for decades. They classified the population into 4 ranks, with Mongols at the top, then Central and Western Asians, then the Northern Chinese, and at the bottom the Southerners of the former Song. Foreigners were preferred in administration precisely because they had no local roots, and among them were Persians, Turks, and a Venetian family. Whether Marco Polo really spent 17 years in Kublai's service is disputed, and there are things missing from his account that are hard to explain. But his book, dictated in a Genoese prison, did what nothing else did. It told Europe that there was a country in the east with cities of unimaginable size, with stones that burn, with money made of paper, with bridges of white marble. And it was read by, among others, a Genoese sailor named Columbus, who annotated his copy heavily and went looking for it. Mongol rule was not long. It suffered from succession disputes, from inflation caused by overissuing paper money without reserves, and from a run of catastrophes in the 14th century, floods on the Yellow River, famine, and plague. The same plague that was moving west along the same trade routes toward Europe. Rebellions broke out everywhere, many of them organized by a Buddhist millenarian movement called the White Lotus, whose followers wore red turbans and awaited the coming of the future Buddha. And out of that came the only peasant in Chinese history, apart from Liu Bang, to found a lasting dynasty. Zhu Yanzhang was born into a family of destitute tenant farmers. When he was 16, plague and famine killed his parents and his eldest brother within weeks of each other, and he and a surviving brother had no land to bury them in and no money for coffins, and had to beg a strip of ground from a neighbor and wrap the bodies in rags. He entered a monastery to eat, and the monastery ran out of food and sent the monks out to beg, and he wandered for 3 years. He joined the Red Turbans, rose by ability, married his commander's adopted daughter, outmaneuvered his rivals, and in 1368 declared the Ming dynasty and drove the Mongols back to the steppe. He never lost the peasant's suspicion of the educated, and as emperor, he became steadily more paranoid. He abolished the post of chief minister entirely after executing the incumbent, on the grounds that the office concentrated too much power, which meant that every one of the 6 ministries now reported directly to him, and the workload was inhuman. He established a secret police force, the Embroidered Uniform Guard. He conducted purges in which the death tolls, counting families and associates, ran to tens of thousands each. He instituted public floggings of officials at court, which was a deliberate humiliation of a class that had previously been beaten only in private, if at all, and which men sometimes died of. He also, it should be said, rebuilt a wrecked country. He resettled millions of people onto abandoned land, planted, according to the records, an enormous number of trees, rebuilt the granaries and the irrigation works, and produced the most detailed population and land registers any Chinese government had ever compiled, on yellow paper for the households, and in maps of land holdings so shaped that they were nicknamed fish-scale registers. His son, who took the throne by overthrowing his own nephew, moved the capital north to Beijing and built there the palace complex that is still standing. The Forbidden City covers 180 acres and is said to contain over 8,000 rooms, and it was built in 14 years, using timber floated down from the southwestern forests and great blocks of stone dragged in winter over roads deliberately iced with water from wells dug along the route. And he sent out the fleets. Between 1405 and 1433, the Ming sent 7 great expeditions into the Indian Ocean under the command of a Muslim eunuch admiral named Zheng He, who had been captured as a boy in Yunnan during the conquest, castrated, and raised in the household of the prince who became emperor. The scale is difficult to believe and is still argued about. The fleets carried more than 27,000 men. The largest ships, called treasure ships, were recorded in the Ming histories at lengths that would make them over 400 feet long, which many naval historians regard as impossible for a wooden hull, and others defend on the basis of an excavated rudder post from the Nanjing shipyards that is itself 36 feet long. Even the skeptical estimates leave vessels far larger than anything Europe had. They had watertight bulkhead compartments, an idea Europe adopted centuries later. They went to Vietnam, Java, Sumatra, Ceylon, Calicut, Hormuz, Aden, Mogadishu, Malindi. They carried silk and porcelain out and brought back spices, ivory, gems, and ambassadors. They brought back a giraffe, which the court identified, hopefully, as the auspicious Quillin of legend, an animal that appears only when a sage rules. They fought when they had to, destroying a pirate fleet in the Malacca Strait and taking a king of Ceylon prisoner to Nanjing. And mostly they did not have to, because a fleet that size does not need to. And then it stopped. The emperor who had launched them died. The court, dominated by Confucian officials who disliked eunuch power, disliked the expense, and disliked trade, judged that the voyages had brought back curiosities and no revenue, while the real threat was on the northern frontier where the Mongols remained. The shipyards were wound down. The records of the voyages were, according to one account, deliberately destroyed by an official who called them deceitful exaggerations. Building an ocean-going ship with more than 2 masts eventually became a capital offense. It is the great what-if of world history, and it should be handled carefully, because the temptation to make it a fable is enormous. The Ming did not fail to become a maritime empire because of a single decision by a few conservative bureaucrats. China's fundamental strategic problem was on land, in the north, where the steppe had produced the Mongols within living memory. Money spent on fleets was money not spent on the wall, and that judgment was not obviously wrong. In 1449, a Mongol force captured a Ming emperor in persons at Tumu, 60 miles from Beijing, and held him hostage while the court hurriedly enthroned his brother and refused to pay. What the Ming built instead is the thing that everyone photographs: the Great Wall as it exists today, With its stone facing and its watchtowers and its crenellations climbing the ridges north of Beijing is a Ming construction of the 15th and 16th centuries. And it is not one wall, but a defense in depth of walls, forts, beacon towers, garrisons, and supply roads running for thousands of miles. It was fabulously expensive. It worked in the sense that the northern frontier was largely quiet for a long time, and in the end it did not matter, because the wall was opened from the inside. The later Ming was a strange, brilliant, decaying thing. The emperors withdrew. One of them, Wanli, who reigned for 48 years, became so frustrated by his officials' refusal to let him name his preferred heir that he simply stopped attending. For roughly the last 20 years of his reign, he did not hold audiences, did not fill vacant posts, and did not respond to memorials, and the government slowly seized up around the silence. Meanwhile, the economy boomed on foreign silver. The Ming had shifted to a silver-based tax system, and the silver came from Japan. And, after the Spanish opened the Manila galleon route in 1571 from the mines of Potosi in South America, an enormous proportion of all the silver mined in the Americas ended up in China, exchanged for silk and porcelain and tea. The great blue and white porcelain of Jingdezhen was produced in kilns employing tens of thousands of people. And it went everywhere. And it turns up in shipwrecks off Africa, and in Dutch still life paintings, and in the collections of Ottoman sultans. The culture of the late Ming was commercial, urban, and unbuttoned. Novels appeared in the vernacular rather than the classical language, and were enormously popular. The water margin, about 108 bandits in a marsh who are the honest men in a corrupt world. Journey to the West, in which a monk travels to India for scriptures, accompanied by a pig, a river ogre, and an immortal monkey who can leap 108,000 miles, and who once fought his way through heaven itself. And The Plum in the Golden Vase, a merciless and pornographic domestic novel about a merchant and his 6 wives that is one of the great pieces of social observation in any literature. The end, when it came from 3 directions at once. There was money. When Japan restricted silver exports and the Spanish supply fluctuated in the 1630s, prices swung violently, and tax revenue in silver became impossible for peasants to find. There was weather. The 17th century was the coldest stretch of what is called the Little Ice Age, and northern China suffered a run of failed harvests, drought, locusts, and epidemic disease. One estimate puts the mortality from a single epidemic in the north in the early 1640s at a very large fraction of the population of the affected provinces. And there were the Manchus. In the northeast, a chieftain named Nurhaci had unified the Jurchen tribes, given them a new name and a new script, and organized them into a military and social system called the Banners, in which every household belonged to a company under a colored flag and provided soldiers. His successors added Mongol and Chinese banners. They had a state, an ideology, and an army, and they were sitting outside the wall. In 1644, a rebel leader named Li Zicheng, a former postal courier who had lost his job in a government economy drive, marched on Beijing with an army of the desperate. The city was betrayed from within. The last Ming emperor rang the bell to summon his officials, and nobody came. He killed or attempted to kill the women of his family so that they would not be taken, and then walked out of the back gate of the palace into the garden on Coal Hill, and hanged himself from a tree, leaving a note that said his officials had deceived him, and that the rebels might dismember his body if they wished, but should not harm his people. And then the Ming general commanding the crucial pass at Shanhaiguan, where the wall meets the sea, faced a choice between submitting to the rebel who had taken his family and possibly his favorite concubine, or opening the gate to the Manchus. He opened the gate. The Manchu banners came through, destroyed the rebel army, entered Beijing, and announced that they had come to avenge the Ming Emperor and would be staying. It took them another 40 years to subdue the south, and some of that was very ugly indeed. The city of Yangzhou was sacked for 10 days in 1645, and a survivor's account of it is one of the most harrowing documents in Chinese literature. The Manchus also imposed the queue, ordering every Chinese man to shave the front of his head and wear the rest in a braid in the Manchu style, on pain of death. The slogan was that you keep your hair and lose your head, or lose your hair and keep your head. It was a deliberate, daily, visible test of submission, and it provoked more resistance than the conquest itself. And yet the dynasty they founded, the Qing, produced the longest run of stable, competent, expansionist government in Chinese history. 3 emperors span most of it. Kangxi reigned for 61 years from 1661, taking personal control at 15 by arresting his regent. He suppressed a massive revolt of 3 Chinese generals in the south, took Taiwan, pushed the Russians back from the Amur, and signed with them at Nerchinsk the first treaty China ever made with a European power on equal terms, and campaigned personally against the Mongols in the Gobi. He also studied mathematics and astronomy with Jesuit missionaries at his court, employed them to survey the empire and cast cannon, sponsored a dictionary of 47,000 characters that is still cited, and toured the South repeatedly to conciliate the Chinese elite. His grandson Qianlong reigned for another 60 years and abdicated in 1796 only so as not to exceed his grandfather's reign out of respect. Under him the empire reached its greatest extent, taking Xinjiang and asserting control over Tibet, and roughly doubling in territory from the Ming. The population went from perhaps 150 million to over 300 million during the 18th century, driven partly by peace and partly by new world crops that grew where rice and wheat could not. Maize, sweet potatoes, and peanuts, which had arrived through the Spanish and Portuguese trade. He also commissioned the largest compilation project ever attempted, the Complete Library of the Four Treasuries, which assembled and copied more than 3,400 complete works into 7 manuscript sets. And while it was being compiled, the works submitted were also being examined for anti-Manchu sentiment, and something over 2,000 titles were ordered destroyed. It was a library and a censorship in the same operation. By the time he died, the machine was already grinding. Corruption at the top under his favorite Hessian was on a scale that beggars description, with a confiscated fortune estimated at more years of state revenue than seems plausible. The population growth had outrun the arable land. The bureaucracy had not grown with the population, so a county magistrate might be responsible for 250,000 people. And a rebellion of the White Lotus in the mountains took 9 years and enormous sums to suppress. Before the collision, it is worth being clear about what the Qing thought the world was, because the misunderstanding that followed was not stupidity on either side. It was 2 systems of dealing with foreigners, each entirely coherent, meeting for the first time with no translator between them who understood both. In the Chinese view, there was one civilized center and a periphery that shaded off into barbarism by degrees. Foreign rulers who wished to trade or to be recognized sent tribute, received gifts of considerably greater value in return, and performed a ritual acknowledgement of the emperor's supremacy. This was not primarily about extracting wealth, since the tribute system usually lost money. It was about ordering the world correctly. Korea, Vietnam, the Ryukyus, Siam, and the Central Asian Khanates all took part, and for most of them it was a perfectly good deal, since it bought trade and security, and cost only a ceremony. the ceremony was the problem. It was the kowtow, 3 kneelings and 9 prostrations, forehead to the floor. In 1793, the British sent Lord Macartney to Beijing with a large embassy and a shipload of manufactured gifts, hoping to open more ports, station a permanent ambassador, and negotiate a proper trade treaty. The Chinese received the mission courteously and labeled its baggage, in Chinese, as tribute from the country of England. Macartney refused to kowtow unless a Chinese official of equal rank did the same before a portrait of his own king. A compromise was found, involving 1 knee, and the embassy was received at the summer retreat at Chengde. The gifts, which included clocks, a planetarium, telescopes, and a hot air balloon with a man who could fly it, were examined politely. Qianlong's reply to King George is one of the most quoted documents in Chinese history. It thanked the king for his respectful spirit, praised the sincerity of his humble desire to partake of the benefits of civilization, and explained that the Celestial Empire possessed all things in prolific abundance and lacked no product within its own borders, and therefore had no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians. A resident ambassador was impossible, since it was contrary to established usage and would serve no purpose. The king was advised to obey and show no negligence. It is usually read as a monument to arrogance and blindness, and there is something in that. It is also worth noticing that the Qing were not wrong about the trade. China genuinely did not need British woolens. The whole difficulty was that Britain wanted Chinese goods badly and had nothing to offer for them, and that asymmetry is what eventually drove the search for a commodity the Chinese would buy at any price. There was a further mismatch of a more practical kind. The Qing handled all European sea trade through a single port, Guangzhou, through a licensed guild of Chinese merchants who were personally responsible for the foreigners' conduct and debts. Foreigners could not learn Chinese legally, could not bring women, could not enter the city, and had to leave in the off-season. Disputes went to Chinese courts under Chinese law, which held that a homicide required a life in return regardless of intent, and there had been ugly cases. From the British side, this was intolerable interference. From the Chinese side, it was an entirely normal way of quarantining an unruly and useful trade. Neither party had any concept of the other as a state of the same kind as itself. The Qing had no foreign ministry because they had no foreign relations in the European sense, only a court of colonial affairs for the Mongols and Tibetans, and a board of rights for tributaries. The British had no idea that they were being processed as a minor tributary of no particular importance. Each side's diplomats went home believing they had been insulted. Then came the outside world, in a form the Qing had no framework for. The British wanted tea, and by the early 19th century, they wanted enormous quantities of it, and they had nothing the Chinese wanted in exchange except silver, which was flowing out of Britain at an alarming rate. So they found something: opium, grown in Bengal, shipped to the South China coast, and sold to smugglers illegally, in defiance of Chinese prohibitions that had been in place since 1729. By the 1830s, the flow had reversed, and silver was draining out of China. And there were, by conservative estimates, millions of addicts. In 1839, the emperor sent a commissioner named Lin Zexu to Guangzhou, an honest and formidable official, who confiscated over 1,000 tons of opium from the foreign traders and destroyed it in trenches mixed with lime and salt, having first, in a gesture that says everything about the worldview, composed a prayer of apology to the spirit of the sea for the pollution. He also wrote a letter to Queen Victoria asking how she could permit her subjects to sell in China a substance that was banned in her own country. It was never delivered. The British sent the fleet, The war that followed was not close. Steam-powered iron warships moved up rivers against the current and shelled forts that could not elevate their guns. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 opened 5 ports, imposed an indemnity, fixed tariffs so that China could not set its own, and ceded Hong Kong. A second war a decade later added more ports, legalized opium, and ended with British and French troops burning the Summer Palace outside Beijing, a complex of gardens and pavilions covering hundreds of acres over 3 days as a punitive gesture. And underneath the foreign humiliation, an internal catastrophe was unfolding that dwarfed it. A failed examination candidate in the South named Hong Xiuquan, after a nervous collapse and a set of visions, concluded on reading a Christian tract that he was the younger brother of Jesus Christ, sent to destroy the demon. He founded the heavenly kingdom of great peace, and it swept out of the South with an army of the landless, took Nanjing in 1853, and held much of the richest part of China for 11 years. Its program included the abolition of private land ownership, the equality of women, who fought in its armies and sat its examinations, and the prohibition of opium, alcohol, and foot binding. The Taiping Rebellion was put down by regional Chinese armies, raised by provincial officials, with some foreign help, and the fighting and the famine that came with it killed, by the usual estimates, somewhere in the range of 20 million people, which makes it one of the deadliest wars in human history. It broke the fiscal and military monopoly of the central government permanently, because the men who had raised those armies kept them. The last half-century of the empire is a series of attempted rescues that all arrived too late. There was a self-strengthening movement that built arsenals and shipyards and sent students abroad, and it produced a modern navy that was destroyed by Japan in 1895, which was the deepest wound of all, because Japan had been the student. There was a 100-day reform in 1898, a burst of decrees on education, industry, and government, ended by a palace coup organized by the Empress Dowager Cixi, who had been the effective ruler for decades. There was the Boxer Uprising in 1900, an anti-foreign, anti-Christian peasant movement that the court disastrously chose to support, ending with an 8-nation expeditionary force occupying Beijing, and an indemnity that would take 39 years to pay. And there was, at the very end, the abolition in 1905 of the imperial examination system itself, after 1,300 years, on the grounds that the empire needed engineers rather than commentators on the classics. It was probably necessary. It also removed at a stroke the ladder that had connected every ambitious family in the country to the state, and left them with no reason to be loyal to it. In October 1911, an accidental bomb explosion in a revolutionary safe house in Wuhan forced a rising before it was ready, and it succeeded, and province after province declared independence from the throne over the following weeks. On the 12th of February 1912, an edict of abdication was issued in the name of the Xuantong Emperor, a boy of 6 named Puyi, who was in the palace and did not understand what was happening. 2,132 years after the first emperor took the title, there was no emperor. The boy stayed in the Forbidden City for another 12 years with his eunuchs and his tutors, riding a bicycle through halls where the thresholds had been sawn away for the purpose, until he was expelled in 1924. He would go on to be installed by the Japanese as the puppet ruler of Manchuria, captured by the Soviets, handed back, imprisoned for a decade, reformed, and released in 1959 to work as a gardener at the Beijing Botanical Garden, where visitors sometimes recognized him. He died in 1967, and if you want an image for the end of the imperial age, that is probably the one. Not a battle, an old man weeding a flower bed, who had once been the Son of Heaven. What was left when the throne was gone was everything that had never depended on it. The characters still legible after 3,000 years. The rivers still needing to be dredged and banked and argued over. The poems still memorized by school children. The idea, planted by the Joe and never entirely uprooted, that the right to govern is granted on condition and can be withdrawn. And the river itself, running yellow and heavy out of the Loess, carrying the mountains of the West grain by grain toward the sea, building new land at its mouth every year, indifferent to all of it. And here our long story settles into stillness. 3,000 years of dynasties, one after another, rising out of the ruins of the last, doing their best and their worst, and passing on. Kings who asked burnt bones for advice. A man who wanted an army of clay to follow him into the ground. A woman who left her tomb tablet blank. Poets who wrote about the moon because there was nothing else left to say. They are all quiet now. The bronzes sit in cases. The scrolls are unrolled a little at a time, in dim light, for a few weeks a year. The wall runs along its ridges with nobody on it. Let all of it drift away from you now, gently like dust, settling on a windowsill in an empty room. There is nothing left to remember tonight, and nothing left to do. The lamps are out along the great avenue, and the gates are closed, and the drum has already sounded. Rest now, let it go. Sleep well, and good night.